we are suffering through a lack of rigid type in our society. As much as they can be a pain to be and to be around, they're the ones that enforce standards. They also enforce the rules. And as much as rules are not cool and annoying and all the rest of it, especially to some types like the aggressive and the endurers, they are necessary. Wherever there is a really insane imbalance in any organization, in a country, in a family even, it's because there isn't enough rigid types enforcing what makes sense, right? The fact that the rigid type go around telling everyone else what they should and shouldn't do isn't a bug of them, it's a feature. Like, someone has to be doing that.
Hi, and welcome to the Rejuvenate podcast. I am your host, Chrissy Hawks, and I'm here with my co-host, the creator of Feel Younger and Genetic Insights, Elwin Robinson. And today we are carrying on the conversation from the big 5 personality types, discussing a different way of understanding character traits. So tell me, Elwin, why did you want to discuss this topic?
Yeah, so this has been really helpful to me. This is something I discovered about 15 years ago, and it's based on the work primarily of Wilhelm Reich and Alexander Lowen. Reich never had a really name for a system. It's generally referred to as Reichian therapy, and Lowen's system was called bioenergetics. Although, confusingly, Ray Peat's system, who we've talked about, is also referred to as bioenergetics. So not quite sure how we're going to title this. I'm going to have to work that out. But anyway, this way of understanding character really helps to understand so much, just like the classic Big 5 in psychology does, but there's some key differences. One of the key differences, which I'm actually really surprised that the modern proponents of it, who at least I've had conversations with, don't seem to really focus on or even appreciate, is how connected it actually is to health. Just to back up this point, I was recently reading Alexander Lowen again. I think he's released like 20 books. He's a very prolific writer, and managed to find one of the few books I hadn't read about 10 years ago when I read most of them. And it was called like The Body and Spirituality, something. No, it's called something Spirituality, not the Body. And so I was like, oh, okay, I'll read that one then. And straight away, the very first sentence of the first chapter is about health and vibrant health. And, you know, the whole thing is about health, and the second chapter is about health, and he describes all these stories about digestive health specifically. And so it's really clear to me that the people who actually created this system, they saw vibrant health and the free flow of energy through the body specifically, without any blockages, as like the goal. And I guess the point of what they were teaching is that they considered psychological health, physical health, mental health, emotional health, spiritual health, all to be one and the same and connected. They were fundamentally against this split between the body and the mind, which actually came about as a result of Wilhelm Reich's predecessor. But I guess we'll get into the history in a minute.
Absolutely. So understanding that it's come from William Reich and Alexander Lowen, and you discussed, or you mentioned that it, is related to the Big 5, and we're going to be talking about these 5 personality patterns. So what are they?
This is a good question, and even this has actually evolved over the course of the last century or so. I think originally they were considered almost to be pathologies. So just to go into the history, actually, I think I'll need to do that to answer the question. So you've probably heard of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud's often considered to be the father of psychotherapy. Psychiatry is actually around earlier in terms of drugging people with mental health issues, but psychotherapy in terms of the idea that there is such a thing as unconscious, so a part of you that you're not aware of and that it's worth exploring and that you can access it through dreams. A lot of people say these days that Freud is, discredited, and to some degree, certainly he is. He was, a pioneer in a very new field. Anyway, but, he was focused on that, working out what's going on in the unconscious. Well, he had a student called Wilhelm Reich, and I think it was in Austria at the time. I think they were both in Austria. Although I think there might have been in Germany as well. I'm not quite sure. Anyway, so Reich really, and so one of the things that Freud believed as well is that a lot of psychological issues, mental health issues, were due to repression, and specifically repression of sexuality. And so Wilhelm Reich kind of took the ball and ran with it. He agreed with that, but he believed that it's more than just repression of sexual desire. It's actually just a repression in general. And you got to remember when Freud is around, it's kind of the Victorian era. So there was a lot more repression of sexual desire back then than there is now, to put it mildly. And so anything you repress does tend to cause problems. So you can see a little bit where Freud was probably, more accurate then than he would be now. Anyway, so what the big breakthrough Reich had was less about like how mental health problems why they come about, and more how. He was more like of a mechanic of anything. And what he discovered through observation of having many patients, clients, is that people who had specific types of neurosis or pathologies, whatever you want to call it, like mental health issues, would have very distinct and, in fact, easily identifiable patterns of the way that they held their physical body. So a person...
That's very interesting.
Yes. So, as you mentioned in a recent episode we did, the idea of the body keeps the score. I can't remember who wrote it, but, like a very big book about trauma and how the trauma shows in the body. But this, as far as I know, Reich was the first person to have this insight, I think over 100 years ago. And he basically tracked this and saw that there are repeating patterns in terms of the way people hold their body, and then the mental health issues they have, the pathology they have, and even beyond that, the perspectives that they have on life, the emotions that they do express, the emotions that they repress, the attitudes that they have, and their very personality. And so he came to call this, I believe, character types. And so he was studying character, and he delineated this to some degree in his books and his writings. Now, his writings were very much written for other mental health professionals. They were not for the general public. I personally haven't read much of Reich's work. It was written in German as well. That's the other thing. He, as a result of the Nazi occupation, fled to Germany, as many great thinkers did around that time. Fled from Germany to the US. He moved to the US, and he took on a bunch of different students. He was quite popular at the time as a student of Freud who had an interesting and helpful theory. And he took on a bunch of students. Now, one of the key things about this way of assessing personality, which is different from most of them, and certainly different from the Big Five, which we talked about, is he believed that these traits were pathological and that they were as a result of trauma or other childhood issues and incidents, and that it could be healed. That was the key thing. So, for instance, if someone is very neurotic and very fearful, we talked about neurosis, if they have a tendency to obsess about, negative emotions and see the dark side in life and see the dark side in themselves and other people, etc., he would say, you're not stuck with that. That's something that you can undo, and you can largely stop being that way if, and this is the crucial point, you undo that pattern of tension in your body, which blocks the free flow of energy and, from a physical point of view, the free flow of blood and lymph throughout your entire body. Now, so he had a student called Alexander Lowen. Alexander Lowen was an American, wrote English, seemed to love to write and to talk. And so he created a big body of work and really helped to popularize Reich's work and put his own spin on it. Their practices had a lot in common. One key difference is all Reich's practice was done lying down. A lot of Lowen's practice was done, standing up. But other than that, it was all about getting this, not getting tension out of the body like many other systems. It was most things that get tension out of the body, whether it's, a massage or a stretching or whatever it might be, all the usual stuff. It gets tension out to whatever degree, but it doesn't undo this very ingrained pattern of holding ourselves. And that is what both Reich and Lowen, who created bioenergetics, sought to do and worked on doing. And I would say there's very little I've done for health that's actually better. I know that may be hard to believe, but there's something about, bioenergetics is actually a good word for it. The free flow of energy that comes about as a result of unblocking these systems. This makes more sense from an Eastern point of view. In the East, the Taoists talked about qi, right? This energy that flows throughout the body. In Ayurveda, they talk about prana, again, this energy that flows through the body. And wherever this energy is blocked, that's where you're going to tend to have problems. And so Wilhelm Reich really coming from a completely different angle, right? As a scientist, like psychologist, student of Freud, not at all, as far as I know, had no knowledge of Eastern systems whatsoever. He came to a similar-ish conclusion about the root cause of disease, but obviously with a different perspective. And so that's where it started. From there, there are other people who have given their own spin on it. Some of them are very good. I'll give you some links to different, people along the genealogy. But the one that I want to mention today is Stephen Kessler. He wrote a great book called The 5 Personality Patterns. The best thing that I have ever found on this, and he includes like a very comprehensive chart as well, where he kind of breaks down the different types. And I'm going to be using that as a reference throughout this episode. So all credit to Stephen for that, and we'll certainly link to his work for that.
So just quickly before you go on, so it's my understanding, I just want to quickly jump in here and make sure I'm following along with you and everybody that's joined us today, is really looking at it from where Reich and Elwin were coming from, is that our body is a free flow of energy, and what's happening is through the childhood trauma. Should be, exactly. Thank you for that. Should be. And then through these childhood patterns or pathologies or traumas that we have been exposed to, then these holding patterns, these chronic holding patterns of tension accumulate, and that stops that free flow. And so they've developed a system that's been able to, one, identify these character traits, and two, to help be able to release the free flow of energy so it's going again.
Absolutely. And I think one of the key thing is, the Taoists talk about, heaven and earth are one and stuff like that. But I've met, practitioners and teachers and stuff who say that their chi is flowing, and yet they're obviously having quite strong holding patterns of muscular tension in their body. So we really need to understand they're one and the same, right? If the body is perfectly loose, so able to tense, and able to relax at will, and both are actually issues. Chronic flaccidity is actually another issue that is the same thing. It's a lack of blood flow because it's still a lack of awareness, lack of connection of the brain and that part of the body. So it's still related. So the key thing about this is, to me, is it gives a explanation as to why it can be so hard to heal. And, we've come up with many explanations, obviously, in these episodes. I'm not saying there's only one. But one explanation is this. The very thing that is keeping the energy and the blood and the lymph, and therefore all the nutrients you need and the waste leaving and all the rest of it, all the stuff we talked about, the very thing that is blocking that creates the personality that you identify with. And so when you start to undo that blockage, you'll actually feel like you don't know who you are anymore. And that's true in the moment. So if you do certain practices to unblock the energy, you might be like a little bit freaked out, like what's going on. And that's true in a more broader sense as well. Like, meaning if you really dedicate yourself to personal change, and it could be nothing to do with anything I'm talking about, right? Maybe you're doing a really intensive meditational practice or yoga practice or martial arts practice, or even something more, mainstream, like you go into like doing Marine Corps training or something like that, which will, really push you to the limit physically. Anything that does can really feel like you're psychologically breaking. And this is very scary to a lot of people. I would say this could even happen without physical intervention, although it's certainly much harder. So someone who puts themselves through a very vigorous kind of personal development, self-actualization, whatever you want to call it, kind of program, sometimes gets to this point as well. And so it's an explanation as to why people so often sabotage their progress when it comes to pure personal development, that we understand that the very thing that keeps us constricted and keeps us unhealthy in all the dimensions, including physically, is something that we identify with. And so I'm not going to dedicate this episode to talking about the practice of how to relieve that tension, because we have to talk first about the identities that we've built, which kind of keep us frozen in place, that keep us from healing, they keep us from being well. And so the key thing to understand about these personality patterns or character types or survival strategies, I'm going to use all three of those words interchangeably, all the three of those terms interchangeably. They all mean the same thing. So we've ended up in the Reichian stroke bioenergetic system with let me use the word character types, 5 character types or 5 survival strategies. Another way of looking at it is 5 responses to feeling unsafe. So another term that Stephen Kessler uses is safety strategies, which I think is possibly actually the most accurate. So a lot of the time, it's very hard to actually see beyond our own safety strategies. Some people just have 1, but in my experience, most people have 2, maybe sometimes 3. And so let me give you an example of this. So, people talk about being triggered, right?
Yeah.
So I was doing great, I was centered, I was rational, I was happy, and then something happened and suddenly, oh my God, I'm acting a bit crazy, right? In some way or another.
Yes.
And sometimes it's very, very understandable. So let's pick an example. Let's say that, someone you don't know just walks up to you out of the blue and punches you in the face. Unpleasant experience. Happened to me once. How do you respond? And you can ask yourself that now watching. I know it's an unpleasant scenario, but I promise it's for a reason. And so I would say that there's a few different ways you could respond, right? So one thing you could do is to leave. You could run away, If you're not able to run away, let's say you're locked in a room, then you would do the psychological equivalent of leaving. Maybe you would disassociate. You would go off into your imagination. You would go off into your head because you don't want to be present for that situation. That's one strategy. Another strategy could be to reach out. Please stop. Why are you doing this to me? Like you're trying to form a connection with that person. Not a bad strategy, right? They recommend that for hostages, for instance, to try and make the person who's kidnapping you humanize you. Or you might try and reaching out for help from someone else, if there's anyone else there. But it's a reaching out thing, right? Another strategy you might employ is just to hunker down, right? The boxing equivalent of that, I think, is, go like that. I remember like as a kid in the playground, sometimes in fights, kids would literally just curl up into a ball, stay away from me. But like just getting into that protective posture, hunkering down as a strategy. Another strategy is you can fight back. You can scream, shout, hurl insults, hurl punches, kicks, right? That's another option. And then another option is that you can start going, what do you think you're doing? You're not allowed to do that. That's not against the rules. This is illegal. I could sue you. I could get you arrested, right? So not attacking, but pointing out that what is going on is fundamentally improper, shouldn't be happening. So now, of course, if people want to be argumentative, they could say, well, I could do each of those things depending on the context, right? The person's bigger than me, I'm less likely to punch them back, et cetera, et cetera. I get that. But the bottom line is we tend to have a go-to strategy. And so I've used the punching in the face as a very visceral reaction, but it can feel like life is punching you in the face all the time to some degree, right? You get a piece of bad news, something doesn't work out the way you want it to, someone that you care about is hurt, there's some kind of threat, whatever. And so that's actually 5 strategies I just outlined to you. And so the terms that we use for those these days, and they used to be called something different, we'll talk about that, is leaving is the first strategy, merging is the second strategy, enduring is the third strategy, being aggressive is the fourth strategy, and then being rigid is the fifth strategy. Rigidify. And so although we can have some degree of choice, we usually won't do a strategy which is not kind of hardwired and pre-programmed into us through these bodily postures. That's the interesting thing. So there's some disagreement about that in the world of people who are experts in this. Some people say, you could be all the types depending on the situation. Stephen Kessler is very clear on this. You can't do 5 strategies simultaneously, right?
Right.
So
yeah.
the point,
But impossible.
So the point is you have to choose, and maybe you wouldn't always do the same thing, right? But most people will choose, one of 2 strategies, maybe depending on context and situation, all the rest of it. They're not flexible enough to choose any of all five, depending entirely on context. So that's the modern way that we describe the five types. The original wording was a lot more pejorative, meaning insulting. Not purposefully, but because Reich was, a psychiatrist. And so the thing to do back then was to name these types after pathologies, like disease states, right? So the original types for these were schizoid, the oral type, which relates to Freud's conception of the different stages of childhood upbringing, the masochist, the psychopath, and then the rigid type. Actually, originally Reich and Lowen in his first book divided into 4 other subtypes. Gets a bit complicated. I won't bother going into what those were, but bottom line is ultimately, rigid is kind of the word that's been used for it all along. I guess that's the only one that has stayed fairly consistent, even if the types haven't.
Yeah, I think the updated version is a little bit better. Leaving definitely sounds a little bit more palatable than schizoid, or just kind of understanding it. But I understand the want to kind of link it to the psychology or things like that of the understanding with it. But let me ask you this: what determines these personality patterns?
Yeah, good question. I'd say out of the old names, probably psychopath was the one that was the least, people are the least likely to want to. And I just want to say, schizoid doesn't mean you're schizophrenic. Psychopath doesn't mean you're psychopathic. These were just terms to describe something. We have talked about psychopaths a little bit in our episodes on narcissism. It doesn't mean that. It just means you're maybe a little bit along the spectrum towards that. Just like schizoid might mean you're a little bit along the spectrum to being, schizophrenic, but only a little bit. It certainly doesn't mean that you're actually that. So what creates these types, these survival strategies or safety strategies? Well, there's actually some disagreement about that too. So certainly Reich's initial conception was right along with Freud's. So meaning that these are, and I think this is largely true, that these are periods of developmental freezing, often happening as a result of severe trauma. So a child goes through different stages of development, which, Freud did simplify. And I think, they're still well known and taught among people who teach, parenting and child psychology and child development and stuff like that. So, there's a period of time where the child is fully identified and merged with the mother. There's a period of time where the child is asserting their own independence, right? There's a period of time where the child kind of learns to get on with others and not just assert its own independence. So these are like phases of psychology. And sometimes people, and it usually is a result of trauma, or neglect, which is really another trauma, or abuse, which is really another trauma. So some kind of trauma, either very severe or just continuous, even if it isn't something, worth making a movie out of, maybe in terms of how dramatic it is, but it's just very ongoing and it wears the person down. They get trapped in these developmental cycles. This is the theory behind it. So for instance, someone who gets that severe, for instance, often it's neglect at that time where they should be merging with the mother, will then spend, to some degree, to a significant degree, will spend the rest of their life searching to merge with their mother or probably a mother substitute. And so, they're always looking for love, they're always looking for attention, they're always looking for approval, they're always looking for acceptance, and they're devastated by rejection, they're devastated by abandonment. And because they're kind of frozen in that stage of development, they didn't move past it and beyond it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So if they didn't receive what they were meant to receive at that time, then no matter how old they are reliving the experience with whomever they're around to try and get that.
Yes. And we'll talk about, what with each type, how it occurs, because it's one of the ways that you can, diagnose yourself is to say, what can I relate to from my early childhood? But that's probably not all there is to it. And I know Stephen in his book said that his teacher for years told him that it was entirely developmental upbringing, which determines what character types person forms. And then after they had several children of their own, they decided saying it was the complete opposite, that it was innate and inborn.
Yeah. Pivot.
And I mean, I don't know if he was kidding about that, and I don't know if I've remembered that correctly entirely, but I don't know. I think that was probably a flippant remark to some degree, rather than that person really completely avoiding avoiding responsibility. But I think the idea is that it's very easy to blame everything on what happens during development, but to some degree, things are innate. And this is something that I've had to learn over the last 5 years. And
let me ask you this question because it just popped up. Sorry to interrupt. Mm-hmm. Everybody is going to be one of these, correct?
Okay, so this is the other important thing to understand. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. The reason we try and avoid the term personality types, even though I probably will say it many times accidentally in this recording because it's kind of ingrained in me, is because personality implies that it's just the way you are. The fundamental difference about this system is that this way of being is not innate, even if there is an innate tendency, which we were about to talk about, possibly, genetically. It's not innate in the sense that you don't have to be that way. There is a response to stress. And the more healthy you are, again, psychologically, physically, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, whatever other dimension, the more you can stay present and centered and act appropriately on the situation. So that's why I mentioned being triggered earlier. All of those strategies I just said, hunkering down, reaching out to someone, running away, etc., all are appropriate sometimes, right? So the strategy is not innately pathological. It's when it's done compulsively. Bring us back to our episodes where we try to really explain that, the addiction and compulsions episode. Every strategy sometimes makes sense. The problem is when we do it compulsively, if we do it habitually, automatically without thinking. And that's often what triggered means, right? We just start responding to something and then later, like an example, someone says they're late and you start ranting and raging and then you hear that, oh, it's because something terrible happened to them. And then, suddenly you go into sadness and guilt and something like that. Like in that case, maybe your default response is to get angry and frustrated rather than waiting and seeing, oh, what's the correct response to this? Should I feel sad? Should I feel angry? Maybe it's appropriate to feel angry. Maybe it's appropriate to feel sad. Maybe it's appropriate to feel fear. Do you see what I mean? But when we automatically react, so that's really what we're talking about here. So ideally, you are none of the types. Ideally, you are centered and appropriate and non-compulsive and non-reactive. What this is a map of understanding how we tend to be reactive habitually. And so in reality, no one's perfect and everyone's going to have these habitual tendencies, except for maybe enlightened people, if they exist. I can't say for sure. So, but everyone else has these. So the goal is just to do it less intensely, less often, and more commonly to be centered, to be appropriate, to be contextual, and to not get into a state of reaction.
Okay. So, yeah, that's so clear. So it's instead of being at the behest of the conditions that are coming to you, it's like, oh no, I'm going to actually respond. So instead of reacting, we are responding appropriately.
Yes, I'd say that's the definition of reacting, but just to clarify, it's more instead of being behest to an automated response within you, you're actually free to respond in a way that's completely appropriate to the situation, or it's coming from conscious choice rather than automatic, robotic kind of acting. And so we talked about this in the addiction episode that, a lot of people who say they're enlightened, what a lot of them say is that most people who walk around are like, either they say they're like robots or they're like asleep, or they're dreaming. And so this is really what they're talking about, the way that we'll react in this automatic way rather than really being present and taking in what would be appropriate in this moment.
And you mentioned, as we were just discussing this, and I asked the question about these traits versus personality. So, what's the difference between character and personality?
Well, that is the $1 million question. And that's something, I want to share insight in, definitely in a future episode, possibly in the next episode, to really get to clarifying the connection between these character styles, these personality patterns, these survival strategies, whatever you want to call them, and the traditional understanding of personality. because I am not convinced that anymore that personality is innate. So let me explain a little bit more about this system before.
Yes, let's get into it.
Also, before I go into explaining each type in enough detail to really understand it, just one more thing about the 5 of them is that there is a hierarchy with these. So the big 5, they're kind of all the same with most systems, with the Enneagram, with the Myers-Briggs and all the rest of it. It's like they're all equally okay, right? Or not okay, depending on how imbalanced you are or depending on context or whatever. With this, because it's more of a pathological understanding, so it's more looking at mental illness originally, there is a hierarchy. And so that hierarchy comes from how early in your development you became stuck. So people with the earlier patterns will tend to be less functional in the world. People who are stuck in the earlier patterns will tend to be less functional in the world than people who are stuck in the later patterns. So generally, if you see people who are highly successful from a material world understanding, they're more likely, a lot more likely, to be expressing the later patterns, the ones that I'll do it, more towards the end of listing the 5. Whereas people who are really stuck, highly dependent on others in one way or another, not really able to function well in society, they're more on the earlier end of the patterns. Now, obviously, that's a generalization. Someone who's extremely stuck in a later pattern will be worse off than someone who's mildly stuck in an earlier pattern. But still, all other things being equal, the earlier developmental patterns do hold you back. And one of the reasons is because, like, a strong sense of self and, I guess what's called ego, but not from the Eckhart Tolle perspective, more from the classical psychological perspective, as in having a strong sense of self, only happens at a certain point of development. And so the first 3 types, the first 3 strategies don't really have that. Or if they do, it's completely folded in upon itself in the case of the third one. And so that's one of the reasons why the later 2 strategies often are more successful in the world, because they have a strong sense of self, which the other ones lack because they got stuck before that was able to strongly develop. And so for that reason, there's often considered to be a hierarchy. Certainly in Lowen's books, he describes, for instance, how the first type, which again, I'll explain all these in a sec, is the most energetically cut off. And then the last type is the least energetically cut off. So Lowen very
And when you say energetically cut off, do you mean with the energy that's supposed to be flowing through their system?
Yes, exactly. Okay. Yeah. So that was his perspective, that there was that very definite, hierarchy in terms of how much energy they have flowing through them, how much energy they're projecting out into the world, and therefore able to affect, the world, other people, all the rest of it, versus how much they are really starved of energy, kind of almost locked inside their own body. So that is how they saw it. Stephen Kessler has an interesting perspective on this, which I think is also valid, which is actually, although what I just said is true, there is a benefit to being more stuck in the earlier types, and it is that you are more aware of your inner world, and you're more aware of also maybe other psychic realms and stuff like that. You're more likely to be in tune with energy. The people who are listening to this in the least, the most likely to go, ugh, nonsense, energy, what's that based on? They're the most likely to be the last 2 types. Where people are like, well, energy, duh, of course, they're actually more likely to be the first 1 or 2 types. So there is some advantage to every type, but certainly in terms of success in the world, generally being more able to project yourself out in the world is going to be more helpful, that being in tune with subtle energies. And, there's a lot of talk about that. Like there's a whole community of people who refer to themselves as empaths, who are often preyed upon by, predatory types. And, they talk about how sensitive they are and how hard life is for them and how often people take advantage of them. And they're right. And to some degree. And I would, correlate it to this, right? And you could say that maybe a more sane, healthy, kind society would honor those people and their gifts and all the rest of it. And maybe in the past, that actually was honored more. Certainly in ancient Egypt, for instance, I know that was a very high functioning society. It's a civilization that actually lasts a lot longer than any other society has in the last 2,000 years. And yet they were very in tune with these kind of other dimensions of focus and being. So there may well have been times where people who had different skills that are not all about projecting yourself in the world and making things happen in the world were more honored, but that's not so much the case anymore generally.
Wonderful. Well, I'm really excited to get into these 5 character traits. So I believe you mentioned leaving is the first. Is that correct?
Yes. So they're called leaving. They may literally physically leave whenever there's stress, if they can. So it's not a misnomer. But more commonly, leaving is actually what they do with their attention. So they will go into their head and start thinking. They tend to be the thinkers. When there was an attempt to rebrand the different types as more focusing on the positive traits, they're often called the creative types. And that's absolutely true. So because they spend so much time living in their head rather than their body, they're the most open to new ideas, to novelty. They have the best imagination, the best sense of creativity. They're actually the most likely types to bring new things into the world. I absolutely believe that Elon Musk, which I've talked about a lot, this is one of the patterns he runs. Reading his biography, they talk about even in highly intense meetings with billions of dollars on the line, he'll often check out and just start going into his head for 10 minutes. And everyone's just expected to wait until he comes back and pronounces the solution to the problem. And that's a classic leaving strategy. And it works very well for him, obviously, at least in this kind of context of he goes off, he comes up with some genius solution, he comes back, and he tells the team to get on with it, right? So that's an example of how it could be applied very practically. Now, of course, Elon Musk has to be running other types to be that practical. A pure leaving type will be off in their head and they were unlikely to bring anything back for practical application because why would they? They don't care very much about the physical world. They often don't care very much about their body, which often gets them in trouble. If a leaving type is ill, which they frequently are, it is usually because they've completely ignored their body's needs.
Right.
In fact, I would go beyond that. It's not just that they ignore their body's needs, they are not even aware of them. They are completely living inside their mind and their imagination. The body is an inconvenience to them, and often they will ignore their body until it creates severe problems. And even then, they will act like it's a nuisance,
So dissociation would be...
Yes.
What? Yeah. Okay.
That's a great way of summing up. Thank you. Dissociation is the strategy for the leaving type. Examples of archetypes that Stephen Kessler used with this were Albert Einstein, Nikola Tesla, ironically, Robin Williams as well. I think a lot of kooky, eccentric people would come under this category as well. Often a sense of humor is definitely possible because they don't take things too seriously because, again, they're living in their mind rather than their body. One of the challenges for the leaving type is to live in their body. That's the main thing for them. And so anything which encourages them to do that, anything that encourages them to focus on physical sensation is good. Any kind of activity, they'll tend to not like things like sports, dance, exercise, anything like that. But if you can get them to do anything like that, it's very beneficial for them. Anything that gets them into their body. They're missing a lot of the skills that are needed because of being in that early developmental stage in order to really be successful. So they're lacking in grounding. They'll tend to be off in their head or maybe in the spirit realm, if you believe in that. They do not have a connection with their core. We talked recently about how, decision-making really is down to being connected to your core and hearing what it has to say as to what's right and what's wrong. People who are strongly in the leaving pattern, or anyone while they're in the leaving pattern, has no connection to their core. So they don't know what's right or wrong, which is one of the reasons why they have a tendency to chronically overthink everything, back and forth, back and forth. People who are, accused of being, Asperger's and autistic, if they're not fully that, I would say, if they're not actually that, but they're kind of accused of that, often that could be because they're running this pattern. They're so in their head and not in their body. And if they're very intellectual, then that might show up more as Asperger's. If they're more, aesthetic, then that might show up more as another type of autism, where they're just disconnected from the world altogether because they don't have the ability to communicate thoughts as well as the Asperger's type. But in either case. So I just talked about communication. In terms of communication, one of the ways you can tell someone's in that leaving pattern is actually when they're lost for words. That's a little bit different from someone who like refuses to talk in a stubborn kind of way. That's more the endurer type, which we'll talk about. But if you can see they're literally struggling and they have no idea how to put a sentence together, that's a classic sign of the leaving type as well. Their fundamental fear is of going insane. Because they're so in their head, because they have a lack of connection with their body, which includes like their gut and the heart and stuff like that, they don't really have a reference point that's reliable for what's true and what's real. And so the threat of going crazy is very strongly in there. However, that's something that they're usually very unconscious of. So, I'll talk about the primary fear for each of the types. With each of the types, they are usually unaware of that primary fear. And actually what a lot of everything they do is to avoid ever being aware of that primary fear. And that's why, not always, but a lot of times, this type will actually be quite intellectual, like I said. Like the obsession with rationality and logic and thinking is actually a way of trying to keep that potential feeling of I could go insane at bay. And in fact, archetypally, this is almost a stereotype, right? That a lot of people, whether it's Nietzsche or Tesla or Einstein, Newton, a lot of these people who are seen as gifted creators and innovators and all the rest of it have flirted with madness, and it's kind of considered as part of the parcel. They believe that they don't fundamentally matters. Another fear is that no one cares about them. In terms of the stress stuff that we've talked about, in terms of the polyvagal theory, they're very firmly in the dorsal vagal state. Their default mode is to shut down.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that response to say, how does that relate here? Of whether it's, I guess it could go hand in hand with some of these these character traits of what that sympathetic response would be potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Obviously there's three modes of the, immune system, of the nervous system. And in fact, I would say the ventral vagal doesn't really correlate with any of them because that's the healthy one when you're not going into a reaction. But yeah, the most obviously strongly dorsal vagal is the leaving one. I would say the endurer one as well is kind of a shut down dorsal vagal state, but they have some fundamental differences as well. The number one illusion that they have, or delusion, is that they are their mind. I am my mind. You see this again in, obviously in geniuses, that they have that attitude as if their mind is all that exists. The whole idea, the whole movement of transhumanism, where you can get your consciousness and download it into a machine, that's such a leaving concept. It would be so alien to probably most other types who just think it's crazy. But one of the interesting things about the massive technological advancement we've had recently is that leaving types, in a way, despite what I said earlier, like socially, they don't have much power. But ironically, in society, actually, they have a lot of power in the sense that they are often creating the breakthroughs of technology that we're so utterly dependent on. And so a lot of the new rich, and not just Elon Musk, but probably, Zuckerberg and the Google guys and Jeff Bezos and all the rest of it, all have a tendency to run this leaving pattern. And I believe, Sergey Brin and I can't remember the other one, the Google guys, they're really into the transhumanism movement. And I'm not at all surprised. It's the kind of thing that you are into when the body is an inconvenience to you, when you identify with your mind as the be-all and end-all of you, then that's what makes sense.
Right. So then let me ask you, how is this pattern, this leaving pattern, you talked about it being a trauma that is experienced. So what is that specifically for this leaving pattern that's established? Yeah,
that's a good question. So I mentioned some of the developmental stages earlier, but an even more primary developmental stage, really the first developmental stage, is to come to identify yourself with your body. So, like I said, when you're very first born, there's no, between you and your mother, there's no distinction of separation, right? Everything is seen as one. A lot of that desire for a feeling of oneness with everything that is kind of like a spiritual perspective is really like a harking back to that time that we felt if we were a newborn, unless we went through some severe trauma, which we're about to talk about, we would have had that feeling of oneness. And then at some point, we learn that we are separate from the mother. And if the mother is able and willing, then she helps us to basically cope with that, to feel okay with being separate. And there are specific situations, some of them the mother's fault, some of them not, where that process is fundamentally goes awry. So one of these can be a birth trauma, where the process of birth is so difficult and painful that the fact of being physical seems like a horror and a nightmare. So for instance, when you have like a breech birth and the cord is wrapped around your neck and you almost died, something like that. Like in the case of someone very close to me, they were born and so they were in a incubator for the first month of their life. So that means all the stuff that you expect as a human need when you're an infant, like touch, someone else's attention, connection with the mother, you don't get any of that. And so remember I said one of the terms for these types is safety strategies. So in a way, these are all reactions we have to feeling unsafe. And so it's really about what made us feel unsafe. And so, on the other end of the scale, maybe we felt unsafe while we were trying to explore the world. Well, that's a different trauma that's later in the development stage. But what about if the biggest time that we felt unsafe is right at the point of birth or just after birth, right? We fundamentally felt unsafe. And that's before we had learned that we are a separate consciousness with a body, there's me and not me and all that kind of stuff. That doesn't develop straight away. Well, in that case, it never fully develops. And so the person feels much more comfortable when they disassociate because they are in an undifferentiated, I am everything kind of state, which is also what you're in when you're dreaming. That feels more familiar. It feels more safe. And so obviously they have to be in the body to survive, but their preference often when they get leisure time, free time, they actually like being alone a lot of the time. And they like, whether it's reading a book, this classic nerd bookworm type will have, tend to have a strong leaving pattern. Whether it's, watching TV, whether it's, playing games, whatever it might be. These are all things where you're not aware of your body and your sense of self is expanded beyond yourself. And so these are things that feel better, comfortable to you when you had that early trauma. So this is usually, I've seen some of the modern teachers even say stuff that happens pre-birth, but certainly birth and the first few months. So most of them say between birth and 6 months. So the thing about that is if nothing happened around that time, you won't have that leaving pattern. No matter how terrible the thing that happens to you at 4.5 years old, it won't create that because you've really gone through the developmental stages that mean that you're beyond being stuck in that mode, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I understand that for sure. So what I'm hearing is be coming into this world or up to potentially 6 months. If there is a trauma that child is experiencing, it is most likely that they will develop this leaving as a safety strategy.
Yes.
So that they feel safe. Okay.
And it will be at least one of them. As I said, sometimes there can be more than one, but it will definitely be one of them.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So the next character trait, merging. Can you tell us about that?
So previously called oral, probably the least insulting of the original terms. So oral is funny because they both enjoy sucking on things more than average, and they enjoy talking. So that's one of the first thing about them. These are the people. So remember I said the 5 strategies. So these are the type of people who tend to reach out. And so there's a lot of, positive qualities about that, right? If someone's a type who prioritizes relationships with other people, cares about other people, nurtures other people, likes connecting with other people, likes being around other people, all of that kind of stuff, that will tend to be someone who's running the merging pattern. If they're doing it for its own sake. If you're trying to connect with people to get something out of them, that's a bit different. That might be one of the other patterns. But connecting for its own sake, that's very much a merging strategy. And so let's talk about the cause of it actually at the beginning this time because it will make more sense with this one.
No, that would be great.
So with the merging type, so we talked about the first stage. So the second stage after that, okay, so you're aware that you are a body and you're separate, right? You have managed that. without a major trauma getting you frozen there. Now, that does mean, though, that you are very dependent on the mother. And you're dependent on your mother's love. You're dependent on your mother's prioritizing you. You're dependent on your mother prioritizing your needs, right? And so from what we understand, a child very much expects to be the center of attention for their mother of at least the first year or so. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but something like that. And nature tries to help with that. It floods both the mother and the baby with oxytocin so that the mother can very easily focus all their attention on the baby, and everything the baby does is wonderful, right? The baby can do no wrong, not forever, right? But for a certain period of time.
Right. Yeah. The baby's being provided for and taken care of for all its needs.
Yeah, absolutely. That's how it feels. But the key thing is you feel like the mother is putting you first. Right?
Right. Okay.
And that the mother's attention is not elsewhere. She's not focusing on something else. She's focusing on you. And maybe she's not focusing on you 24/7. At least as soon as you're upset, and of course, baby show that by crying, she'll come quickly, right? Because she cares about you. And now, if she doesn't come quickly, it might not be because she doesn't care. It might be because she's at work. It might be because she's asleep. It might be because she's busy. It might be because she thinks she's helping you by letting you cry yourself to sleep. But the child doesn't take it that way. They take it as no one cares about my needs, because they're not able to look after their own needs, right? They're helpless. They can't even sit up or whatever, anything. So if no one's taking care of their needs, then that's a problem. And needs really is the crux of the merging type. When you feel that your needs are not met during that crucial developmental period, and it's really, from birth, but probably more like 6 months because of that, feeling separate thing first, like I said. So around 6 months to around 2 years, something like that. Around 2 years, a terrible twos, that's where you start to feel a sense of like wanting to assert yourself. So not then, before then. So between feeling like you are separate and needing to assert yourself, there's that period where you are very dependent and you are very needy and you're very, narcissistic, which is totally appropriate. When you're that age, you believe that the whole world should revolve around you and that it does revolve around you. And when the whole world doesn't revolve around you, you don't get it because you have a fundamental feeling that it should, because your needs need to be met. Well, when there is neglect or abuse during that period, it creates a wound where the person feels like a few different things. They feel like their needs are never going to be met, is the first thing. So energetically, they feel like a bottomless black hole of need. Second of all, they often feel like they're never going to be really loved in the way that they want to be loved. And often they make do for a kind of supplement or substitute for love, which is attention. And so these are people who feel like they're unlovable, low self-esteem, low self-worth, and they are seeking attention. Now also, because they're stuck in that developmental stage where they never got to that place of asserting their own boundaries, they tend to be very bad at boundaries. And so often they are going around the world seeking love, seeking attention, seeking to get their needs met, even though they secretly believe that they never will be met. And then they are not able to say no, not able to assert themselves, at least not easily, and they just want to be liked. They just want to, please people. And so fundamentally their perspective is coming from need. Now, they don't always express that. So there's actually a kind of subtype of merging type that we talk about in this system. Most of the teachers talk about it. So you have the merging type. So there are some people who you meet who are just needy and they're not afraid to acknowledge it, right? They want your time, they want your attention. They're not necessarily pushy or anything, but they're also not afraid to show that, right? I recently watched a few episodes of The Office, the American one. That boss is a classic example of that, right? I think one quote at one point in the episode, he goes, "Oh, it's amazing when everyone's listening to what you have to say and paying attention to you. There's no better feeling in the world," he goes. Most people don't want to admit that that's how they feel, but the kind of classic merging type might be able to admit that to themselves. That's all they really want. They want people to pay attention to them. They want people to give them, love and admiration and stuff like that. They don't necessarily want people to look up to them. They just want to feel connected and like people care about them, right? That's the crucial thing.
Let me ask you a quick question, because we just did, the Big Five, and talking about, and also our narcissism episode as well, which was highly fascinating. Everybody check that out if you can. So, that attention, which is that very big point for that narcissist, how does that compare with it being emerging a safety pattern versus somebody having, narcissistic tendencies, traits, or disorder?
I'm very glad you brought that up. Okay, I won't comment on the Big Five because I want to do a future episode mapping these together, but let me discuss the narcissism aspect. So, I said that all of these 5 patterns, with each of these 5 patterns, you might do them a lot or only a bit. You might have it mildly or you might have it severely, right? So some people only do a survival pattern when they're under really excessive amount of duress, right? Only in a real crisis time. Most of the time, they're present and centered. And to be honest, most of us, that's the best we can ever hope of being, right? That's the pinnacle of evolution, is that we can be centered and present most of the time and only occasionally be reactive, right? On the other end of the scale, there are those who are so traumatized and or so comfortable or committed, I'm not quite sure what the word is, or entrenched in their pattern that they cannot imagine ever not doing it. So these are people who are always doing their pattern, right? So I would say that the different flavors of narcissism are someone who does a particular type of merging. I was about to explain that. And they're basically stuck in it all the time. They can't get out of it. They can't get out of it, and they don't want to, right? So if your fundamental belief that you're 100% married to, that you never don't feel because you're completely entrenched in this, is that life is about getting people's attention, your needs are never going to get met, but you're very, very hungry, and so you're going to do your best to get them met, then, and also that the whole world revolves around you, because that is normal at that developmental stage, then yeah, all of the rest of the narcissistic behavior does make sense. And then, the different types, whether it's your grandiose narcissist or your covert narcissist or whatever, are just really about what other patterns they're also expressing. That's the other element of it. So maybe we can talk about that later when we get to those patterns. But just to go back to the merging, there's 2 types. This is the only type that's been split into 2, generally. So because that neediness, if you watch The Office and the guy's like, please pay attention to me, it's so odious to most people, right? It's not, I don't think anyone likes someone needy. People like to be needed sometimes, but I don't think many people go, what I'd love is more needy people in my life, right? Now, some people, no. They do it anyway because that's what they do. They don't have any choice, right? But a lot of people, I don't know, it's 50%, maybe something like that, who are really in this pattern, what they realize at some point in their life is, often it's around the teenage years, is, you know what? This is not attractive to people. People don't like it when I'm needy. And so they learn to do what they call a compensated oral or compensated merging, which is where they actually flip it. And so what they flip it as is, the kind of classic merging type is going around saying, love me, feed me, look after me, nurture me, give me stuff, care for me, pay attention to me. So the compensated oral does the opposite. They go around saying, how can I help you? How can I give you attention? How can I look after you? How can I nurture you? How can I benefit you? How can I love you? And so the idea of this strategy is, and it's usually unconscious, that the person decides that the only way they can get their needs met is by going around and meeting everyone else's needs. And so often these people are very different in terms of their presentation. They seem to act the exact opposite. Whereas someone who's going around basically focused on what they can get out of you has, one kind of a reaction to you. Someone who seems to be primarily focused on making your life better is going to get a very different reaction. And it's not very easy to see that the core of it is actually the same. And this is why often people who do the compensated oral, they sooner or later they get into a pattern of kind of like resentment, because they feel, I'm working so hard to meet your needs and you're not meeting mine. But of course, the thing is, they haven't asked. They're not aware of their own needs some of the time. And even when they are aware of them, they don't just state them openly. and honestly, because they believe that then they'll be rejected. And so they often go between, resentment, a little bit of an outburst of anger, although nothing much, because they don't have a really strong aggressive sense, and then to feeling guilty because they do care about other people. And it's just like this cycle that they often get in. They're also the most likely to get into chronic fatigue and exhaustion, all the rest of it, because I said they don't like to say no. Right? That's
people pleasers.
They still have that in common. So they're going around helping everyone. Can you help me move? Yeah, the compensated oral is the only one who says yes, right? They're like helping everyone else. They don't want to say no to anyone. They want to make everyone happy. So they push themselves to the limit. They exhaust themselves. They often collapse. So again, can you see how all this relates to health, or can relate to health?
Yes.
So with the classic oral, their health problems are more because they feel this emptiness. They're constantly consuming. So they may be sucking cigarettes all day because that's an oral sucking activity. They may be eating food all day. That's an oral activity. There's a very obvious oral activity, but anything, any kind of distraction, social media, junk food, drinking alcohol, drugs, whatever it might be. These are all ways of filling a feeling of emptiness inside ourselves. As addicts talk about, we talked about that in the addiction episode, the 12 steps. They talk about like a feeling of emptiness is fundamentally at the core of most addictions, which I believe is absolutely correct. So that's really that merging pattern. I would say there's an epidemic of this type. And this was what was believed as well by people like Lowen, that some of the other types, like the rigid type that we'll talk about last, used to be more common. They're less and less common. And the merging type especially is more and more common. And this is partly because even though in many ways people are more present parents, sometimes overly present, which is a different issue we'll talk about next, they're still very, very distracted. And so that kind of deep focus and absorption in your infant is just less likely to happen when you have a phone on you with notifications on, right? So that's really the challenge. And even before the phone, bit of social commentary, but I guess ever since women were encouraged to go to work, for instance, that's another factor that would mean that they're less likely to be there with the child up until the age of 2 years old, fully immersed in them as if the child's the center of their world, which is really what the child expects or needs. And then, there's a bunch of other sociological factors. There were a bunch of parenting books, I think, around the early part of the 20th century, which encouraged you to not indulge the child too much. I think Dr. Spock and all that kind of stuff. So there's loads of these different factors that ended up with whole generations of kids that for one reason or another, and sometimes it may be through parents who totally thought they were doing the right thing, were not fully immersed in their child's needs like maybe would have been true previously.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. I just need to take a moment to quickly tell you about a way that you can support the podcast by getting high-quality, affordable supplements that Elwin and I personally use, and that's Feel Younger. What I love about Feel Younger is they have great quality products with minimal fillers, but the prices are very affordable. You can call their customer support team 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, and in my experience, they're really helpful and friendly. And what I love most of all is the amazing descriptions Elwin's written for each product category about that topic. There's so much information and education on it. I've actually learned more from reading their product descriptions than I have from most articles. So, to support the podcast, please use Feel Younger for all your supplement needs. And to let them know we sent you, you can use promo code RejuvenateMe for a 20% discount off your first order at feelyounger.net. That's 20% off your first order with promo code RejuvenateMe at feelyounger.net. Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, because there's whether the mom goes to work or stays home, depending on what's going on, these things can be occurring, just like you said, depending on the education that's out there, depending on the environment that we are now finding ourselves living in. So, no, this is very, very interesting.
I would say this type is the most likely to have health challenges caused by being this type, for all the practical reasons I said about over-consuming all kinds of things. But also, they're much more likely to display psychosomatic illnesses, so kind of brain-created ones, which we talked a lot in the chronic health episode, and we'll probably talk about again. Chronic pain episode, which is like illnesses created by the mind, maybe because deep down you want attention, or maybe if you're the compensated type, because you're sick of looking after everyone else's needs, and you're like, well, I have needs too. And so, I've read many books with people describing stories about how, I was just looking after everyone else, and then I got, X serious diagnosis that could kill you. And then I finally started to focus on myself and my own needs. This is like a very, very common story. It happens a lot. And they're also especially likely to have digestive issues because of the whole issue with feeling like they're not receiving enough nourishment. Yeah, of course, in one way it can manifest is in overeating. And as a body type, being chubby and pudgy is one of the ways they manifest. But the other physical way they manifest is often being underweight. So their physical body is kind of like a emblem of how they feel, which is, I'm not getting enough nourishment, right? I'm not getting enough nourishment. And sometimes, they're much more likely to have food intolerances and all that kind of stuff, Lowen talked about, because they feel like the nourishment they're getting is not right. That is the other aspect of it. So this doesn't always happen as a result of neglect. It can be that the parent puts lots of focus on you, but it's not loving. And so this happens, for instance, if you have a parent who is narcissistic, whose whole world revolves around them. They may pay attention to you because, they, for various narcissistic reasons, they want to indoctrinate you. They want you to be a loyal follower, whatever. They want to be seen as a good parent by other people. But you can fundamentally sense that their focus isn't really on you. And so when you have that, you can often, develop a feeling like the nourishment you're receiving is not really nourishing. And so that can, translate into a perception that the food you're eating is not really nourishing. People as well, and I know I'm one of them, who are obsessed with whether food is nourishing or not, whether it's got enough nutrients in, whether it's got some hidden toxicity. Again, there's validity to this inquiry, especially in this day and age, but it often actually originates in these kind of childhood issues.
You did, just quickly as well, because I'm quite visual, you gave us some examples of individuals that were the leaving pattern. Do you have any examples of those that are the merging pattern?
Yeah, I mean, the ones that Stephen Kessler lists include Marilyn Monroe and Oprah Winfrey. I think it's, generally the ones that are the archetype of being very nurturing and looking after you. I guess that's more like the Oprah Winfrey archetype. That would be more the compensating type. Whereas the type who seems needy and yes, also seductive, that's also part of it. Because seduction is a kind of strategy that is not aggressive and assertive, right? And so it is a type of strategy that some oral types are quite good at. And so that's, I guess, more where the Marilyn Monroe example would come from. Okay,
great. Okay, perfect.
But to be honest, it's not that many celebrities, famous people probably who really strongly have that. And it's probably more commonly women who are looking after everyone else. That would be the really key element. And they're often not in positions of power and control. That's why The Office is a comedy, because you don't see someone that needy usually in the position of authority. That's an unusual situation. They're usually going to be someone who is dependent on someone else.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense.
I would say, sorry, just to add, a pure one you won't see as a celebrity, but someone who has merging, but who also has maybe some aggressive or maybe some rigid, they very commonly are celebrities. So remember, one of the things that these types love to do is they love to talk. Their favorite strategy for communicating is talking. And so on its own, as I said, it's fairly uncommon that they get to a really prominent position. But if you combine that with a certain aggressiveness or a certain hard work ethic, then you can get someone who is very, famous. And famous would be the word. There are all kinds of people out there in the world who have a lot of power. There are all kinds of people out there in the world who have a lot of money. There are all kinds of people out in the world who are highly successful. But the ones you've heard of are the ones that like attention.
Right.
And the ones that like attention will very often be running the mergent pattern. That's why they like attention. Because there's a lot of people talk about fame is a nightmare. It's to anyone who's not running the mergent pattern, it's not worth it. Whatever benefits you think will come from being famous, being, having money or status or whatever. You can get all that without fame, without everyone knowing who you are. So if you get to the point of everyone knowing who you are, it's almost certainly because you really, really want everyone to know who you are on some level. Now, a lot of people are conflicted about that. I mean, say someone who runs merging and leaving, which is not that uncommon, they'll be really conflicted. One minute they really want attention, but then also as soon as it becomes overwhelming, they run away, they disappear.
Look at me, don't look at me. Look at me, don't look at me.
They disassociate. So I'm not saying it's always simple, but yeah. So the main thing that I talked about, the main fear of the leaving type is going crazy. The main fear of a merging type is abandonment, rejection, and deprivation. It's not getting their needs met on a dramatic scale, right? That all of those have in common. So whereas the primary emotion that the leaving type is looking to avoid is that fear, the primary emotion that the merging type is trying to avoid is shame. And they will have different strategies for that. We talked about the importance of shame with narcissism as well. So that's one of the fundamental things about someone who is totally narcissistic, as in narcissistic personality disorder, is they feel no shame. So most people who are merging are not that, but they will go to great lengths to avoid feeling shame. So because deep down, what's the connection to shame? The feeling of need they feel is shameful, right? That's the crucial thing. So either it's shameful and I just have to put up with it because I need to get my needs met, or it's shameful and therefore I'm going to compensate and do the opposite and deny that I have any needs and focus on everyone else's needs instead. Another hallmark to tell these people apart is the kind of motto of, or the thing that they'll say to themselves again and again. If you hear the phrase "I can't" out of their mouths again and again and again, then you'll tend to be dealing with a merging type. They can't do it for themselves. That's why they need you, right? That's their fundamental thing. Now, the opposite is the compensator type, and their attitude is, I can do it. The aggressive type is almost the same, but theirs is I will. It's a bit different. It's like they genuinely conquer. Whereas a compensating merging type convinces themselves for a while that they are superhuman, but then
But it's false.
Sorry?
But it's false.
Well, they will collapse.
They'll collapse. Yeah.
They will collapse. Stephen Kessler calls it puddling. Yeah, they will collapse into a puddle sooner or later. Whereas an aggressive type really will just keep going and conquering. And they may have failures and whatever, but they won't just collapse into a puddle of depression and I can't and nothing's possible and despair and all the rest of it. That's much more likely the compensated merging. Yeah,
those are all really great distinctions. So the leaving was the loss for words. The merging is I can't. So, okay, yeah. And then the compensated over here is like, I could do that for you, but watch out because there might be a sting a little later.
Yeah, and that's on the extreme. On the high end is I can do anything. They often have a cycle. They like superhuman, struggling, collapse, reaching out again. They often go through that cycle.
Okay, perfect. So our next on the list is enduring. Can you please go into explaining that type?
Yes. This is the type that I struggle the most to identify with, I'll be honest. One of the things I really like about Stephen Kessler's book, I'll recommend it again, is he has a great section near the beginning of each chapter that describes each type where he spends quite a few pages helping you to really immerse yourself in the perspective of that type. And I have to say, when I read the ones that I identify with, and again, it's not right or wrong. Ideally, you're none of them. But it was like so comfortable and of course. And then when I read this one, for instance, I'm like, this is so alien to me. This is really not how I feel about things. So I just want to admit that at the outset. But anyway, let me talk about it. So used to be called the masochist type. Their greatest gifts, let's start off with gifts, is their ability to ground themselves and to be grounded and to be practical, and also their stamina. So the endurer is a good word for it. The downside is that when horrible things happen, they feel like they have to endure it rather than say leave or resolve it. But the good thing is that sometimes you can't resolve an issue, right? You just have to endure it. And so if there is a situation that you genuinely just have to endure, they're the best at it. So they're the most patient, for instance, where there's the aggressive type, there's the least patient, they're more likely to get frustrated and start, smashing things if they don't get their way and all the rest of it. The endurer looks at them like, what are you doing? And just, this is suffering. This is normal. This is, like,
this is what we do.
It's no big deal to them at all. And so there's a definite benefit to that. I mean, I'll explain this further maybe when we talk about aggressive, but I would say the classic warrior type is enduring and aggressive. So they have the aggressive capacity, but a lot of being a warrior, all the stories, like your Wolverine is I would say the superhero ultimate endurer. Like, no matter all the horrific things that happen to him, he's able to, recover and bear it. He's not Superman. He's not invincible to it. He suffers endlessly, but it doesn't kill him. He endures, right? So that's Wolverine's a very popular archetype, I think, for that reason. The endurers love him. So that's like the main strengths that they have, I would say. The current culture that you and I are in right now is not particularly a place that endurers thrive, but there are many that they do. For instance, if you are in a dictatorship or any kind of, like my wife Hannah grew up under communism when she was young, endure is a good strategy under that kind of regime. Because if you speak up, if you speak out, if you rebel, if you do anything, you are crushed and you might be killed, right? So in that situation, just being willing to say yes and put up with it is a very, very helpful skill, and you're much more likely to survive. So all of these strategies are good in a context. Ditto, if you're kidnapped, if anything horrible happens to you like that, if you're an endurer, you're very likely to get through it. In fact, you're probably expecting it to some degree. So how does this develop? Let's talk about the developmental stages first. Okay. So we talked about the first two. I won't recap them again. So the third one is where a person attempts to individuate, right? So I would say 2 to 4. Different people have slightly different perspective of this. Whatever that terrible twos phase is, where they go through that stage of trying to assert themselves and saying no to everything, right? Making all kinds of demands. It's that phase. What phase is that from your experience as a parent, Chrissy? What ages?
Yeah, it does depend on the individual in themselves. But yeah, it's in that 2-ish phase, sort of, I would say, for sure.
Okay. And again, I say, when do people, end it? But of course, some people never do. And that's the point. Actually, this type and the next type are both about that phase, but with one key distinction. This type, the endurer type, forms when they try and assert themselves, they try and assert their individuality and separateness, and that they have their own preferences, right? Their own things they do want to do, their own things that they don't want to do. This could be anything from I do want to eat this and I don't want to eat this, to I do want to do this, don't want to do this. Now, obviously, there has to be some limit on that. When you're 2, you are not able to judge what is safe and what is appropriate and all the rest of it. But the parents or let's say beyond parents, because it could be schooling and grandparents and other things, but the authorities in the life of the child who are too enthusiastic about preventing that behavior will tend to create an endurer child. So if they're highly focused on discipline, there are some cultures, I've come across people who are raised in them, where breaking the will of the child at this stage is actually considered desirable, in the same way that a wild horse is broken. And again, just to maybe explain that perspective a little bit, if you were, say, living in 1960s Russia, this was actually quite a smart strategy to do to your child. Because if they start mouthing off to you at 2, they're going to start mouthing off to your teacher at 5, and they're going to start mouthing off to the government at 18, and they're going to go to the gulag and they're going to die. So you have to get them out of this ridiculous behavior of being rebellious and assertive and all the rest of it before it gets them killed. That's kind of the mentality behind it. I would say that, to some degree, it is therefore like a serf kind of mentality. But, there's another aspect of this, of course, which is the kind of martial element, right? So if you're going to be in an army, you could be aristocratic or whatever. But if you're going to be in any kind of martial perspective, you often have to do what the boss tells you to, right? Irrespective. Otherwise, it's going to get you killed. It's going to get a bunch of other people killed. So again, that's an example of where that mentality makes sense. The will has to be crushed. And in fact, a lot of that armed services training, at 18 or whatever, is an attempt to do this again. But it doesn't necessarily work, of course. Many people leave voluntarily. Many people fail and drop out and all the rest of it. But the people who thrive in those conditions will be running an enduring pattern. They'll be able to do what they're told. And so that crushing of the will creates a particular type of personality who is kind of paradoxical. On the surface, they are the good girl or the good boy. So it kind of sounded like the merging type that I was explaining earlier as that as well. So let me explain the distinction.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, could you please? Because, yeah, I think this feels like there's a little crossover there.
So the merging is maybe good because they are nice and loving and focused on, connecting with you. But the enduring type is good because they behave. They are obedient. That's the distinction. So you're a good girl or a good boy in terms of because you do what you're told and you're not naughty. That's the distinction. The all type, they're good because they're cute or they're lovable or they're fun or whatever, right? So it's very different. So on the surface, that is how they feel. This type, more than anything, hates confrontation. The merging type doesn't love it either, but they don't really understand it. So again, I use that office archetype, right? That guy's always getting into confrontation, even though he doesn't really know why, because he's just, being himself, right? But he's not also avoiding at all costs, right? He'll be happy to be pushy to get his needs met. And similarly, a compensator or type will be happy to be pushy if they want to help someone else, right? They'll be, come on, I'm going to bring you soup when you're ill, even if you don't want it. Like they're pushy about nurturing you, right? Whereas this type will not be. They will avoid confrontation at all costs. They just want to behave. They just want to be a good boy or a good girl. Why? Because they still fear that jackboot. They still fear the punishment. Could be, that they were actually beaten, but it could be, sharp looks. It could be shouting. It could be whatever. But the sense of threat, if they don't do as they're told, was so strong in that developmental period that they always feel that. They will always be willing to bow to an authority when that authority is threatening, at least when the authority is perceived to be threatening. However, so far I've painted them as if they are just, robots who just do whatever they're told. Not quite true. They actually have an immense current of resistance in them as well. But they are not aggressive, they are passive aggressive. So they will not say they don't want to do something. They will say, I'm going to do it, and then not show up, or cancel at the last minute, or do it, but in a way that sabotages you. So they will submit, but then they will seek to get their revenge in a subtle way.
Right.
They love revenge. Their favorite kind of movies are often revenge movies, the endurer type. So they fundamentally feel as if they can't get what they want, they can't assert themselves, they can't put up boundaries. But unlike the merging type who just accepts that that's not part of their life, they're not happy about it. In fact, they're very unhappy about it in most cases, but they don't show it, right? So they will often, start fights, start confrontations, but they will never admit to it, through passive aggressive behavior. So you might innocently say to them, would you like to do this? They will say yes because they want to please you and they don't want to, whatever, if you're in that position with them. And then they will find a way to make it not happen. And then, you'll be like, hey, you said you were going to be there and I waited for you for an hour and you never showed up. And then they're like, hey, why are you starting a fight with me, man? I'm just, so it's like passive aggressive. I guess that's the main point. So they don't believe they have autonomy. I guess that's the key thing. They believe that they are under someone else's thumb and they don't like it. Their big fears are having their space invaded. So I said they're very grounded. So their strategy of their stress is to kind of hunker down. Often in the positive sense, they like being around nature. They're good with nature often. They may be good with, the garden or agricultural stuff. They're more likely to be good at DIY and engineering and all that stuff. So they love all that practical earth type stuff. But they also really like their own space. That period of development is where you first assert not just your preferences, but also your personal space, your own territory, right? That's what a boundary is about. And so while they don't feel often the ability to strongly protect their boundaries, they are very upset if you violate their boundaries in some way. If you come into their personal space, if you come into their office without knocking at work, all of that kind of thing, it really upsets them more. Whereas emerging person will leave the door open and, let alone will mind if you don't knock before they come in, right? So again, very, very different attitude. So we talked earlier about shame. The enduring type is also very sensitive to being humiliated. It's a big thing for them. And they also have a big fear around being controlled. Even though, as I said, on the surface, they will go along with it, you could say they almost have a pathological need to assert their autonomy. But again, it's going to be through a passive sense if they're dealing with anyone that they perceive as authority. So this whole...
And how would... So go ahead. So I was going to ask you, how could they assert that in that passive way?
So as I say, sabotage is one of the strategies that often be used. Pretending that they didn't hear you, pretending that it never happened, that it was never agreed to in the first place, agreeing that it was said, but acting like you demanded they do it, insisted they do it, when all you did is ask them. So those are, some of the favorite strategies off the top of my head.
Right. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
So they really identify resistance. So I don't know if you remember the Rage Against the Machine song, F you, I won't do what you tell me. That is
right.
That is the anthem of the endurer, but it's what they're saying in their head and maybe what they're going to say to their colleagues, but they'd never say it to the boss, if that makes sense. But
that makes absolute sense.
But it's absolutely how they feel deep down. And as I said, that's why they love people. They love stories of rebellion. They love stories of revenge, because it's like overcoming that oppression that they constantly feel. So we talked about default emotion, fear and shame. So for this one, it is both resentment and guilt. So both the endurer and the rigid type, which we'll talk about later, the superego, which we can just define as should. So the should voice in your head play a really central role in their lives. With the rigid type, they have a different strategy, which we'll get into. Remind me if I forget. But the endurer type, the should, is a voice in their head that they're constantly rebelling against. Right? So the endurer has internalized the dictator, the authoritarian. Maybe often it's the voice of the parent who is, overly dominating. And they'll constantly have that voice in their head. And so they will feel a lot of resentment, and they will feel a lot of guilt for not going along with it sufficiently, perfectly. Right? So they're trying to be perfect. This is why they're often very reactive to any kind of criticism, because they both already feel very guilty they're not doing it. And they feel very resentful that you're making any kind of demand on them. So being a boss of an endurer type is challenging. Initially, it's delightful because they just do everything you say. But after a while, you're like, there's something going on here. That's when all these other dynamics will tend to come into play. So whereas they share something in common with the leaving type, they look similar, but there's a key distinction. So the leaving type is more likely to just literally leave, whereas this type, because they're more based around resistance, they're going to be more like, leave me alone. That's more their thing. They're like pushing you away. Again, if they feel like they can. If they don't feel like they can because they perceive you as an authority, then they're going to be full of resentment and fear. But if they feel able to, then their default is going to be to push you away. If they don't feel able to, their default is to placate you and agree to everything you say.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense, because like you were saying with the leaving, it's almost as if they're not really here. But with the endurer, it's like, don't even come near me. It's like, ooh, yeah, look at my eyes, blah, gone. Something like that. Okay, that makes sense, yeah. And then were there any examples of individuals that are this type that we would know of?
Yeah, I mean, the ones that Stephen Kessler gave, I would say are not as good as mine. He uses Eeyore in Winnie the Pooh. Samwise Gamgee in Lord of the Rings. I think the second, I don't really know Eeyore, so maybe it's a great example, actually.
I know Eeyore, yeah. Winnie the Pooh, he's like, okay, all right.
That is a great, yeah, they are the most likely to complain as well out of all the type. But it's a different kind of complaining, it's more oppressed complaining, whereas the merging type is more of a whiny, needy complaining. But yeah, they're most likely to believe that life is fundamentally miserable. Life is struggle. Life is difficult. Life is hard. Life is something to be endured. So Samwise Gamgee is more the positive aspect, that he was the loyal follower, right? That he would follow along. And that's part of the positive aspect of the endurer type. If you are in a position of authority for them and you don't abuse them and you respect their boundaries and all the rest of it, you will never have a more loyal person in your life. They are actually very loyal, to be honest, even if you are abusive to them, but they'll just be sabotaging you all the time. But still, if they perceive you as having authority, and they perceive a lot more people as being authorities than they probably should, then they will often have a very high level of loyalty. Again, why these kind of people would be very valuable in a warrior setting, like I talked about, right? I used Wolverine. I suppose all of these are fictional characters. In terms of real life, I think Joe Rogan, this is one of the patterns he runs. I remember him saying that he watched the John Wick film about 40 times while working out. Also remember him talking about him working out, like really, 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 like pushing himself to incredible limits. This is one of the things that endurers do, by the way. Endurers as a body type, I talked about, I don't think I said leaving, so just quickly. Leaving tends to be often thin, but not necessarily, but often disjointed, and they will have some kind of imbalance in their body. So like Jeff Bezos as an example, he's got one eye that looks much bigger than the other. So that's classic. Another one is like having one shoulder much higher than the other. So they'll have that kind of asymmetry. That's the main thing about the leaving type. Merging type, I said, they're either look like malnourished or they look overly fed and often puffy and squidgy. The masculine type are actually, they look big and stocky, but often muscular. They often, for some reason as well, especially the men, tend to be more hairy than average. And so one of the reasons is because they actually quite like resistance training because it's more suffering that they can inflict on themselves. So, and inflicting suffering on themselves is kind of a philosophy for the masochist type. The endurer type.
Yeah, so I was going to say, because that was the old name, but it was, so masochist and endurer are the same, essentially.
Yeah, in the same way that oral and merging are the same, and the reason why they inflict suffering themselves is interesting. It's because they believe that life is suffering, and so I'd rather control it. We said the control was one of the other aspects of it as well. Possibly, Wim Hof would be another example of this. He's putting himself through massive amount of suffering with cold exposure. As I said, this is probably with an aggressive spirit as well, which we'll talk about next, in order to be Joe Rogan or to be Wim Hof, because of the endurer type is more likely to hide. They're not going to become those kind of world famous people on their own who are known for, going their own way and stuff like that. But that ability to endure hardship and, in fact, to inflict massive amount of hardship on yourself is a tendency of the endurer type.
Right. Okay. So yeah, that makes sense. And when you were saying the statements, I think you've mentioned a few here, which is kind of like life is hard. Would that be kind of like what that endurer would? Because the leaving person doesn't really have the ability to respond. The merging person is as I can't, and this one is kind of like life is just hard. Or is there something else that they say?
Yep, I would say that's definitely one of them. I won't would be another one. They do love to resist, but again, they may be saying it in their head, right? So the boss will say, "Will you do this?" Of course, boss. And then, I won't do that. Who do you think you are? All that kind of stuff. So resisting and complaining, I would say, are very much part of it. But as I said, on the positive side, they're able to endure way more than all the other more wimpish types from their perspective, like me, are able to do. I am low in enduring. I'm not very good at it. And that is often a problem. There's a downside to everything. So, yeah, feeling like they are failures, like they failed, like they will fail, and therefore it's not even worth trying. That's one of the other common things. They tend to be slow. They tend to, if we're talking about the elements, they're more the earth element, as we've talked about. So they tend to speak slowly. They tend to move slowly. They tend to do tasks slowly. But if they're at their best, they will do it well. They'll do it methodically, because then a lot of tasks, the main thing that stops you doing it well is that it's tedious in life. And so they are okay with the tedium. So they will do those tasks actually better than most people.
Perfect. Okay, so we've been through 3 of the types. Now we're at the 4th type, which is aggressive. So, Elwin, can you please explain that to us?
Yeah, so the next type is called the aggressive type. I don't love that name, but I can't think of a better one. Because aggressive implies anger, and that's not really what's meant from a psychology point of view. Aggressive more means the willingness and ability and desire to push yourself out into the world. That's really more what it's about. The endurer is capable of just as much anger, although, as I said, they'll tend to often hold it in. The rigid type actually often is angry, and actually you could say is angry more frequently than the aggressive type. So it's really not about anger. It's about having that killer instinct. It's about being willing to be pushy, in one sense or another, right? Being willing to, assert yourself, to rebel, to go your own way, to demand things, to initiate, to push through resistance, all of those kind of things. That's more what's meant by aggressive. So I just want to clarify that at the outset. It doesn't necessarily mean they're expressing anger. Yeah, it's ability to push out and push through resistance into the world. Whereas endurer are also good at resistance, but it's inner resistance, right?
It's like hunkering down, like that endurer is going to hunker down, but that aggressive person
pushing out. That's the key thing about them. And they're really the only type who's good at that. And so anyone who you admire, who's gone and blazed a trail, who's done something new, even, we talked about the geniuses earlier, like a Tesla or an Elon Musk, they wouldn't have been able to do that if they didn't also have that aggressive instinct. I love what Stephen Kessler says about this. Most mythical story heroes are aggressive, and most villains. It's both. Because in both cases, they're willing to push beyond what the average person is willing to do. Whether you're, Sauron from the Lord of the Rings or the Hobbit. Like in either case, right? They were willing to, I can't remember what the Hobbit's called, the main character, but, they were willing to go on this massive journey and risk everything and, push beyond what any Hobbit had ever done before. So that's that aggressive impulse. Even in that case, it was entirely pure. It's still that willingness to push yourself out there into the world and do something that no one's ever done before. So
I'm guessing that the aggressive type is not afraid of confrontation.
No. Not only are they not afraid of confrontation, you could say that they often actively seek it out, especially if they're excessive. Now, again, not to say that aggressive type is necessarily a type getting involved in fights all day. They are just as likely to be highly charismatic. They're, to be seductive. There's not as clear subtypes as the compensating with the merging, but there's sometimes considered to be more the domineering aggressive type, and they tend to have a body type that is more upper body focused. They tend to have a big upper body specifically, whereas the endurer will tend to have quite a big, strong lower body as well. This difference between the two is the aggressive type will have a large upper body as compared to lower body. That can also happen as a result of, training incorrectly in the gym and never doing leg day and stuff like that. I realize that, but I'm saying overall that is a tendency. And then there's a seductive type. And the seductive type is, in case of a guy, it may be, handsome and muscles, and woman, it's the curves and all the rest of it. But so the seductive is the other type. What they both have in common, whether it's domineering or seductive, is they're good at getting their way in the world. That's the thread. And some people switch between the two. If they're able to dominate, then they will. And if they are not, then they'll seduce. Although some people will seduce just because it's their preference. But if seduction isn't working, maybe then they'll switch to trying to dominate you. It's like one or the other. But the art of influence, persuasion, getting your way, all of that kind of business, entrepreneurial stuff, salesmanship, all that kind of stuff, leadership training. This is all kind of training on how to have more aggressive traits in a way, and also have more balanced traits if it's good training, right? Because we don't want to do this in a in an imbalanced way. So again, let's start with the developmental stages. So the aggressive type is interesting. It's the only one of the 5 types that actually Reich didn't come up with, and the source of the type is not clear, even though everyone agrees it exists and everyone knows about it in this world. It's not actually in Lowen's first book either, where he goes through all the character types. A lot of people say that Reich was actually the aggressive type. He kind of was. He was willing to stand up to authorities. He ended up being thrown in jail and died in jail in the 50s because And all his books were burned by the US government because he decided in the end that therapy and body work were good, but there were more direct ways to unblock the blockages of free flow of energy for the body. And he started to come up with these devices, which honestly, I don't know if they work or not, but he claimed that they did, and he ended up getting thrown in jail, and he was not happy about it. So this sometimes happens to aggressive types. They're so willing to rebel. They're so willing to confront. They're so willing to tread a new path and to challenge everyone and tell everyone that they're wrong, that if they either become the authorities or they become the rebels, which are squashed down if you push the aggressive far enough. And so, many of the people who, are considered authorities, I would say, are also aggressive types. It just, in his case, it happened to not work. I think my personal opinion is if he'd stuck with this stuff, with the therapy, the body work, and the character styles, he would have been very much more successful. And in fact, there were, in that point of his life, people kept coming to him, wanting to learn about it, and all he wanted to talk about is these devices instead. So he kind of sabotaged himself. Maybe he had a bit of endura along there as well. Self-sabotage is definitely part of the endura. It's not just sabotaging other people. There are masters of self-sabotage, the endurers. But maybe he was endura aggressive. Anyway, Lowen didn't really see it, and yet it's become part of the system. I think Lowen did explicate it, but it's not in any of his books. So where they are in the developmental stage is, so this, as I said, the first three we've talked about, none of them have a strong sense of self and a strong sense of being able to assert themselves in the world. So as I said near the beginning.
Those are those first three parts, the leaving, the merging, and the endure.
Yes. And they all have a tendency to not be super successful in the world unless they have one of these two other patterns along with one of those three patterns. So with this pattern, there are a few things about it. So it tends to happen. The ideal scenario for creating an aggressive type is if you have one parent who is highly seductive. Seductive meaning they tell you you're the best, you're great, you're special, you're going to be a great, whatever. You're going to be a great leader when you grow older. You're going to be a president, whatever, right? And then you have another parent who is brutally and often specifically violently or sexually abusing you. And so,
but it doesn't have to be that specifically.
It doesn't have to be that. That's the most stereotypical example. Okay. And if I explain why, you'll see why, it doesn't have to be that. So what creates the aggressive is this combination of, yes, I do have the right and ability to assert myself. Again, none of the other types we talked about so far have that. But the world is an unsafe place. I can't trust anyone. And I have to dominate, otherwise someone else is going to dominate me. So again, if you don't have that influence that abuses and hurts you, then you're not going to have that perspective that you need to constantly be on your guard and dominate others, because why bother? If you don't have that perspective that you're great and you can do it, then you're not going to have the ego strength to try and dominate others and dominate the world or whatever it might be. So that's why there does have to be the combination of both of those two factors, is my understanding. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be two different parents. It can be one parent who does both things to you. And this, often happens, especially with sexual abuse, right? So, sometimes it's like a seductive thing. Oh, you're great because they're, trying to be sexual with you. And then sometimes it's beating you because, you better not tell anyone. Da, da, da. So that's an example of how that might show up in the person coming from just one person. It could also be because this is a later developmental stage. Again, this is a bit more unclear, but kind of 3 to 6, 7 is kind of when we think that the aggressive pattern forms. And, so it could be someone at school. It could be someone in, some other kind of group that does this to you. But one of the key things about the aggressive type is they have been betrayed. That's the crucial thing. It's not just that they've been hurt and abused. It's that they've been hurt and abused by someone that they loved or someone that they trusted. And so what forms in them is, I can't trust anyone except for myself. Now, this is different from the others. The leaving type is I can't trust anyone, including myself. So I'm going to go off into a fantasy world. The merging type is I can't trust myself, but I do trust you, so help me, right? The enduring type is I can't trust anyone, and I'm just going to suffer, right? I'm just going to hunker down. But the aggressive type is I can't trust anyone, so I need to be in charge. I need to be the boss. I need to dominate. That's the conclusion that they come to. So, as I said, if there is a parent or a figure who kind of pumps up your ego to get you there, that is the common situation, but it isn't necessarily that. You could say that, genetically, there are some bloodlines that really do seem to tend to dominate, tend to end up in leadership positions. And so possibly that could be the thing that gives you the strength to not collapse like the merging, or to collapse in on yourself like the enduring, and to keep pushing yourself out there, even though you feel like you're all alone. So there are different things that's why it's more variable what creates that type. But that's really to understand that type. So the philosophies we haven't really talked about philosophies yet. Yeah, let's do philosophies of all of them. But the philosophies that really appeal to the aggressive type is like Nietzschean kind of stuff. It's kill or be, or Darwinian stuff, kill or be killed, survival of the fittest. The time that they feel the most alive and most happy is when they feel power. That's the best feeling in the world to an aggressive type.
Yes. Oh, hence where you'd called it, the old label was psychopath, because we talked about the difference between a narcissist and a psychopath.
Yep.
Narcissist is attention, the psychopath is power. So this is, okay, so then that makes sense where that name came in. Okay.
Yes. I wouldn't say that the real psychopath, like the actual psychopath,
no.
would ever have only aggressive. They would have merging as well, at least, I would say. But yeah. Okay,
perfect. And so then you mentioned that. So for the aggressive type, what about for the others? Do you want to name those here?
The philosophies, yeah. So
yes.
The leaving type are most likely to have a very intellectual philosophy of life. So the very complicated mental kind of ones will be the most appealing to them. The merging type, their philosophy, one of their favorite philosophy is love is all you need. That Beatles song, right? Can't we all just be nice to each other, right? Any philosophy as well that is based around meeting needs, they're going to like. So Karl Marx is a classic one. From each according to their ability, to each according to their need. That is music to the ears of a merging type, because it means everyone gets their needs met. That's all they want. They don't, unless they're quite, strongly stuck in it, they don't only want their needs met. They want everyone's needs to be met, right? That's their ideal. So that's the kind of philosophies that they love. Endure, again, probably quite obvious. It's, pessimistic philosophies, right? Nihilism, I guess, on the extreme end. But life is hard. Life is a struggle. Probably the more everyday philosophy of, you just got to go to work and work hard and, look after your family, like that kind of philosophy. And then the philosophy that really appeals to rigid type, which we'll talk about soon, is, I'd say, more of either the kind of personal responsibility. You can do it, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Or, maybe more politically, it might be more conservative, Let's keep things the way they are. Let's stick with what works. That's a popular refrain of the rigid type. And then, the enduring types, just go back actually politically. They are most likely to actually like a revolution, right? Like to overthrow the existing regime. I mentioned Rage Against the Machine earlier. I think they were like communists. So for them, communism would be appealing for a different reason. I think it's Jordan Peterson what's his name? Not Aldous Huxley, the other one, George Orwell, who said that, he was a socialist for a while, but he eventually realized that a lot of the leadership, they hated rich people more than they loved the oppressed. And so that thing of I hate the oppressor, that's the enduring philosophy. Whereas I love the oppressed, that's more of an emerging philosophy. And of course, if someone has both, then they have both, right?
Right.
But yeah, so I would say that the more right wing is more aggressive stroke rigid, the more left wing is more merging stroke enduring. And then what politics? would be more leaving. They're not interested in that at all. Or if they are, it's on a very mental, conceptual level. They don't have strong emotional feelings about it.
Right. Okay. Okay. All right. Yeah. So that's quite a lot. And any certain individuals that we would know?
Yeah. So as I said, all heroes and villains. So it's both Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, or whatever. It's all the big heroes and villains throughout history. So, benefits. I've talked about benefits of all the others, so let's talk about this. So they have a lot of energy compared to all the other types. They're charismatic, they're fun, they have willpower, they have initiative, they're most likely to not give up out of all the other types. Generally, if you want to create something new in the world, you have to either be an aggressive type or have an aggressive type on board, otherwise it's not going to happen. Because the world always offers resistance. And if you give into that resistance, which is very easy to do if you're anything other than aggressive, then it will never happen, So it takes that aggressive type to do anything new in the world. It takes the leaving type to come up with a new idea, but it takes the aggressive type to actually make it happen against resistance. And, to be fair, it takes the enduring type to do all the mundane work that is involved. So the aggressive type might be, the visionary entrepreneur. And then the leaving type is the idea person, and then the merging type is, the customer service, the HR, all the people who deal with people, and then the enduring type is the mechanic, the engineer, the one who actually makes it happen on a practical sense. And then the rigid type is the one who is kind of the manager and enforces all the rules and keeps everyone to schedule and all that kind of stuff. So, like in an organization, every type has value and, in fact, is crucially necessary, but in terms of getting it out there in the world, that's the aggressive role, specifically. Resourcefulness is another good word for them. So they're the least likely to say, I can't. But as I said, their I can is different from the compensated merging I can, because it's based on will, not belief. So the compensated type, merging type, believes they can until they exhaust themselves. But the aggressive type has the will to follow through and to keep following through. This is partly down to what I talked about earlier, where I said Lowen talked about how leaving has the least energy available to them because they're most cut off. He would say that either rigid or aggressive, I've seen different perspectives on that, but they have the most energy available to them. And as I said, in terms of getting out there, the leaving type has the least ego strength, the sense of self, I deserve to exist. The aggressive has the most sense of ego strength, like I deserve to exist. What I want to have happen, has a right to happen, that kind of feeling. So downsides, obviously, this tendency to create confrontation unnecessarily is huge. A lack of compassion is the number one downside of the aggressive type. Because they believe that the world is kill or be killed, dog eat dog, all the rest of it. Because they don't trust anyone cares about them or has their interests in mind. They're like, well, you don't care about me, so I'm not going to care about you. That's the simple logic, right? And if someone does care about them, they won't trust it and they won't believe it. They will probably think that it's, an attempt at manipulation or seduction or something like that. And so long as they have that mentality, they will tend to be not necessarily cruel and heartless, unless it's, again, on the extreme end, but there'll be lower compassion, low empathy than the other types generally. And also, because if you're running the aggressive pattern, people tend to be either tools to help you get your way, or they're obstacles getting in the way of you getting your way, Whereas, so the leaving type kind of doesn't have compassion for others either, because they're disassociated, but they're not that bothered about you, because you're not in their way or a tool, So that's so even though in a way leaving is less compassionate, and we kind of see that in the kind of Asperger-y people who are running the top companies in the world these days, they really don't seem to care about human beings. But generally, in the past, they haven't really had positions of power where that matters too much. And it's only recently that these types have got the level of power and influence where it really matters how little they care about humanity. And I'd say actually, probably an aggressive type has more compassion because they have a lot of dealings with people, and therefore that compassion will tend to grow. Leaving type, even if they're around people, they're in their head, so that tendency to feel for others can often really be retarded, like it never grows in the first place. And so As I said, in the past, that was never much of an issue because they never did much other than share their ideas, which could be dangerous, like most of your philosophers are leaving types.
Right.
But these days, I would say their leaving types' potential lack of compassion can be a big issue as well. Anyway, so see. Yeah, in terms of, perception of time is an interesting one. So I said, endurer types are the slowest. Aggressive types will be the quickest. They'll be rushing all the time. They'll be frustrated. They'll be impatient more than any other types. They'll also speak more quickly. We said the endurer type will speak slowly. The emerging type will speak with a lot of emotion and maybe with a kind of whining or pleading quality to them in their voice and in their eyes. The aggressive type is more demanding and declaring and insisting and convincing and persuading. That's more where they're coming from. Form of complaint. This is a good one. Emerging types will like to complain by saying, I can't, or it's too difficult. Enduring types will just like to complain about everything. Aggressive types will love to say, it's not good enough. That's if you hear that a lot from someone, they're probably running the aggressive pattern. So big challenges for them, trusting others, as I've already talked about. If they can learn to trust anyone, even one person, that's a big healing for them in their development. It's interesting. So with the aggressive type, one of the other things that they need to do is learning to trust anyone or people in general is one thing. Learning to trust an authority or something bigger than themselves is another big thing. And so I find that aggressive types are actually quite often inclined towards atheism.
I was going to just say, yeah, that makes sense.
Because they don't want to believe that there is any thought bigger than them. And if they do, that force is thought to be malevolent, but rather than benevolent, right? So philosophy is about like the universe being some kind of predatory torture kind of place and stuff like that. That will be more appealing to the aggressive, as it is to the enduring. But the difference is the endurer feels like that's something they need to endure. The aggressive will tend to believe that either that's something they have to overcome, like overthrow the old order, or maybe align with the old order. So those are kind of two different methods for power. So as much as it's true to say that both the heroes and villains tend to be aggressive, it's also true to say that the people in power and the people most actively rebelling, actively, not passively like the endurers, actively rebelling against the people in power, both tend to be aggressive people. The people with rigidity as well are more likely to be inclined to join the people already in power. The people who are more purely aggressive are more likely to rebel and go, no, it's going to be a different way, my way instead. So, as I said, their number one goal is to feel powerful. And their number one fear, I would say, is feeling betrayal. Because, again, if you're trying to achieve something in the world, often you are going to need to work with other people and stuff like that. If you want to be a boss, you can't avoid that, for instance. And so a fear of betrayal. An extreme example of this in a very negative sense would be like Stalin, who was famously, kept taking all his closest advisors and assuming that they were betraying him and throwing them in the gulag. And then it just, spread out more and more. Everyone on his path, he would assume they're betraying him. I think in Game of Thrones, I can't remember the character, but there was one like that as well, right? It's, this belief that everyone was betraying them. And the other really big thing that they fear is feeling vulnerable. So if you believe that the world is a scary place and it's kill or be killed, then the last thing you want to be aware of inside yourself is any vulnerable feelings. So that is the primary thing that they're going to want to avoid at all costs within themselves, is feeling their own vulnerability. So, this is off where some advice is completely different depending on your type. So, say emerging type, and an enduring type, they really need to connect with their anger. That tends to be what they're unaware of for different reasons. Especially the emerging type is completely unaware. The enduring type is more in denial. Like they're vaguely aware, but they don't want it to be true. The aggressive type is completely in denial and unaware of their vulnerability, their fear, their, possibly feelings of insignificance and all that kind of thing. That's the scariest thing in the world to them.
Right. Yeah, because that makes sense, because they're very in tune with their anger. That is how they're expressing. That's how they're sharing. But that deep vulnerability underneath is what is their fear.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
And just on a practical level, they're the ones who are going to be the most confident in the way that they present themselves. Rigid are also very confident, but rigids, their confidence is kind of more fragile because it comes from often the hierarchy they're a part of. The aggressive confidence is very innate. It's like, you could drop them naked and, with no money and nothing in the middle of nowhere, and they'll still walk around like they own the place to some degree. So it's very undependent on the resources around them. They're also the most likely to feel superior to those around them. So leaving type feels alien to everyone around them. Merging type will often feel inferior, and they're okay with it so long as you look after their needs. The enduring type feel inferior and they're not okay with it. And then the aggressive type feels superior and they're very happy with that. And they do not want to feel inferior. It's one of the feelings they'll try and avoid at all costs. And if you do make them feel inferior, they will get their revenge one way or another.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know.
And again, look, someone could be aggressive plus merging. Obviously, everything I just said there will be softened to a large degree, right? With each of these, I'm talking about the pure types. Pure types are pretty rare. I think often it's in pairs, but you have to kind of understand them each separately before you can start to understand the composites.
We're going to take a quick break to share with you one of our amazing sponsors, Genetic Insights. What makes Genetic Insights uniquely valuable is that they test over 83 million different variants, which guarantees a 99.7% accuracy on all of their DNA reports. With over 100 reports available, you get comprehensive insights into what your DNA is telling you about how to optimize your health today and in the future. I've found reviewing my results to be incredibly accurate and applying some of the recommendations, which are personalized to your individual DNA, to be extremely helpful for me and my family. I also loved how easy it was to upload my raw DNA data that I already had from previously using Ancestry.com because Genetic Insights supports uploading raw data from all major platforms. To get your health reports, go to geneticinsights.co and get 20% off today by using coupon code Rejuvenate. Remember that supporting our sponsors supports our podcast, which allows us to keep sharing this important information with you free of cost. So, go get your Genetic Insights health reports by going to geneticinsights.co and use coupon code Rejuvenate for 20% off today. Yeah, no, I love that you're breaking this down to the pure things, because I was going to save this to the end, but I might as well say it now. It's like, because there's lots of things that you're saying that's like, oh yeah, that sounds familiar, or yeah, oh, maybe do a little bit of that, do a little bit of that, do a little bit of that. So it's not like that these are isolated. There are these potential waves, or we do this more, but we have maybe this a little bit and maybe that a little bit less. So there's degrees, yes?
There's degrees, but it's really about what's your go-to reflex,
Yes.
So
yes.
Again, a healthy person can actually do every pattern depending on what's appropriate. But, let's say, if someone attacks you, something attacks you, if someone lets you down, right? Like, what is your response? If it's to collapse in, I'm never going to get what I want, then that's the merging, right? Or if it's to reach out, oh, help me, that's the merging. If it's to dissociate, that's the leaving. If it's to start a fight, that's the aggressive, and you can't both collapse and puff yourself up and start a fight simultaneously, right? You're going to do one or the other. That's the idea.
Well, beautiful. I know we're coming up to our final type, the rigid type. So if you would please enlighten us.
So the rigid type, more than the other, I'll come at this from a different angle. Their whole life is oriented around should. Now, so is the enduring type, as I said earlier, but there's a crucial difference. So should is the superego. You should do this, you should not do that, right? The difference is the enduring type has a should voice in their head, like an authoritarian parent, and they're rebelling against it, often passively, but still. The rigid has a very different strategy for dealing with that should voice that often comes from a very heavily should parent. They identify with it. So they are the arbiter of should. They are the promulgator and defender of should, meaning they will tell themselves all day, every day, what they should and shouldn't do. They will tell you all day, every day, what you should and shouldn't do. And that's one of the differences, I'd say, between a rigid type and a compensated merging, because sometimes they look similar. Often they both have a strong sense of like work ethic and stuff like that, and maybe even they're quite organized, which is rigid tendency. But one of the things that makes you very clearly rigid is if you have a lot of judgments about other people all the time. So if you don't have that, if you have quite a strong sense of what should be the case, but you're really focusing on looking after people all the time, or doing, caring about people, but connecting with people, that's more compensated merging. If you're really more focused on what is right and what is wrong, and whether you're doing the right or wrong thing in every given moment, and whether the other person is doing the right or wrong thing in every given moment, and you're keen to enforce that, that is a classic rigid type. I was thinking about this earlier. I said this a little bit earlier in the interview. I would say, and Lowen, I know, said this, that we are suffering through a lack of rigid type in our society. As much as they can be a pain to be and to be around, and I'll explain more in a second about why that would be the case, of course, they're the ones that enforce standards, right? They have the highest standards out of all the group. They also enforce the rules. And as much as rules are not cool and annoying and all the rest of it, especially to some types, like the aggressive and the endurers, they are necessary, right? We're starting to see, I would say, in the Western society, what happens when laws, for instance, aren't enforced. What happens to a society when laws are not enforced? I would say one of the interesting things to me, I know this is going to be controversial, but like traveling a lot and seeing different cultures, I won't name the culture, but I remember when I arrived in this country and there was a supermarket. It looked like a normal supermarket. There were 6 people greeting you at the door, 2 people manning the checkouts, and no one in many months, by the look of it, cleaning the toilets. So that is a society with a high amount of merging and a low amount of rigidity, right? All about connecting with people. Most people connecting people at the door. There was a line around the cashiers. Okay. Annoying to an aggressive type, and a rigid type, but not the end of the world. But the toilets are horrific, and that's bad for everyone. Like this was a country where, infectious disease is rife. And I really see that, like, there was no one working at that store who was a rigid type who went, that's not acceptable. That toilet shouldn't be that filthy. There shouldn't be that many people at the door. There should be more people manning the tills. Now, I'm using a silly example from another country, but of course, that's true everywhere, right? Wherever there is a really insane imbalance in any organization, in a country, in a family even, that just doesn't make any sense, it's because there isn't enough rigid types enforcing what makes sense, right? And so again, that's why I say the fact that the rigid type go around telling everyone else what they should and shouldn't do isn't a bug of them, it's a feature. Like someone has to be doing that. Someone has to be making sure that the toilets get cleaned, like metaphorically, right? And, a compensated merging type might say, I'll just clean the toilet because it needs doing and, it'll help someone and that's nice. But compensated merging type, eventually, if they do all the equivalent of cleaning the toilets, they're going to collapse and they're not going to be doing anything, right? So someone has to make sure that someone's doing all the work that needs doing. So I would say, that's their function in society. Someone needs to make sure the trains run on time, all that kind of stuff. So how do they get to be the way that they are? This, again, is most open to interpretation. This type is the least like all the others in that it seems to be less about a wound, although Lowen still believed it was about a wound, but it seems most like this is a trait that's passed on generation to generation. So meaning, if you have the rigid type strongly, if it's in your top 2, it's almost certain that a parent or primary caregiver, at least one of them, were running the same pattern, and you've inherited from them. So they had a strong sense of should and should not, and they passed that on to you. In terms of developmental stuff, what Lowen and some people say is that one of the things is that they have a feeling of rejection and heartbreak is one of the big things to them. So a little bit different from the betrayal of the aggressive type. So with the aggressive type, a primary wound is that they trusted someone and then they were betrayed. Sexual abuse, violence, these kind of extreme betrayals especially. With the rigid type, it's that they reached out to someone in a loving way and that was rejected. And so that then makes them rigidify and go, I have to be better. I have to be perfect. I cannot make any mistakes. If I'm just perfect enough, and so they often do embody perfection. If you look at someone and go, wow, I really admire them. They look great. They're successful. They're healthy. They're this, they're that, A lot of the time, that's someone running a rigid pattern. And that's partly because they genuinely are that, because they are highly disciplined, highly organized, highly conscientious, highly doing the right thing. And it's also partly because it's very important to them to project outwards this image of perfection. So if you actually go between the lines, rigid people, one of the main things that they have issues with is intimacy, vulnerability again. But aggressive types, they struggle with vulnerability because they're afraid of being betrayed. The rigid type is afraid of opening up, having their heart broken. So it's a slightly different thing if they're not perfect. So as a result of that, rigid men or women, they often look quite strongly gender conforming. So meaning rigid women look very feminine, rigid men look very masculine often. Often they'll be quite successful with the opposite sex. They'll easily get girlfriends, boyfriends, husbands, wives, or whatever. But often they won't have a very deep, intimate connection with that person. It'll be more superficial. And, they're more likely than most to cheat on their partners. That's often one of the, behind the scenes things that you don't see with the admiration and the perfection, because they still deep down feel like there's something missing. They don't realize it's because they're not willing to be vulnerable and intimate with the person that they're with. So they keep searching for someone else. And because their primary wound is around not connecting with someone on a heart love level, they will keep trying. So often they'll have many partners, maybe be serial monogamists, this kind of thing.
Can I just ask one clarifying thing? And I think I know this, so I just want your, yes, that I've got it right. Because when you said the rejection for the rigid, there's also the rejection for the fear of rejection for the merging, but the merging is more about having their needs met.
You got it.
And the rigid is more about their heart being broken as they're extending this and not being perfect enough, correct?
A love connection, yes.
A love connection.
Yeah.
Okay.
So a genuine love connection, right? Because the merging type often believes that all they care about is love, but actually what they really care about is needs. Whereas the rigid type believes what they care about is being perfect and making sure everyone else is as perfect as possible, but what they really care about is forming a genuine loving connection. So it's kind of interesting.
Okay.
So, and their version of being perfect basically is understanding the rules as well as possible and enforcing them as well as possible and living up to them as well as possible. And as I said, again, that, is appealing. They're not necessarily super charismatic. They're not necessarily as full of initiative, but they can be admirable. So they're more someone that you admire from a distance rather than someone who you feel really, engaged with, as it were. Political thing, again, I'll give an example. Ron DeSantis, whatever you think about him, everyone, thought he was going to be very successful. Whatever you think of his policies, everyone thought he's going to be very successful. And he is absolutely not doing well at the time of this. And everyone says it's because he is boring, he is rigid, he has no personality, he has no charisma, he seems very focused on policy, so laws and rules, but not. He seems to not particularly enjoy connecting with people. He doesn't have the desire to go out and, win people over and connect with people like is necessary for a politician. So this is a classic example to me of, what I talked about, where rigid types are not in favor. 100 years ago, someone like that, who was like, no nonsense, all policy, whatever you think of his policies, if you think they're demonic or wonderful, whatever, he's that type. And that's not popular anymore. We want the other type. I won't mention his name, but the charismatic one, the showman, right? That one is polling very, very much better. And everyone's saying, they don't have the charisma of that type. And so that's the aggressive type, right? The charisma, the fun, the seduction, the excitement, the drama of the being willing to rebel and confront people and all the rest of it. That's more exciting to people. The person who just creates laws and makes sure they're followed, that's not appealing to people in this day and age. But it is, as I said, they are the people, again, as long as you like their policies, that really you want in charge a lot of the time, because they will actually not just be all talk. They will create rules that you agree with, and they will actually make them happen, rather than most politicians these days who seem to be adept at getting people to like them. They win the popularity contest, but they very rarely do what they say. Some of the time it's because they're psychopathic and they have no intention of doing what they say. They're only after their self-interest. Sometimes it's because they're narcissistic, meaning that they just want attention and adulation. They just tell people what they want to hear, and they have no idea how to make it happen, even if they want to. And I'm sure there are other reasons as well. But, I think those are two primary ones. But that boring type who just gets things done, as I said, is out of favor. So yeah, rigid is the reason that's the only name that's kind of stuck is because that's their personality, and it's also their body. So you can see it in their body. As I say, they tend to have the most appealing bodies out of all of them, most well-proportioned for their masculine or feminine identity. But if you look more carefully, and especially if you do body work on them or anything like that, you'll see that they're actually very rigid. The posture that they have might be stiff. They might walk in a slightly stiff, robotic kind of way. The person I mentioned earlier, there was being accused of that as well, among many other things. They don't have that fluidity or that flow, both in their attitude to life and in terms of their body movements. They tend to be guilty of black and white thinking. So it's either right or it's wrong. It's either good or it's bad. It's either yes or it's no, right? They don't like the gray areas. They don't like the maybe. They really don't like, the feelings, right? They care about facts, not feelings.
Yeah, rules.
Rules, but now I'm on a slightly different thing. So one thing they have in common with the leaving type is they're both very focused in the mind.
Right.
The difference is leaving type is escaping in their mind, whereas the rigid type is taking the mind and imposing it on the body and the world around them. So one of them is going out, escaping to the mind. The other one is taking the mind and imposing it on themselves and everyone else around them. So,
right.
But because
of the should, because it's a should.
The should,
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. But also, they're very into being rational, for instance. What is true or false? What is right or wrong? It's not only about should, it's also about facts and evidence and logic. And again, this is annoying, especially to a feeling person when it's at the extreme. But again, our whole justice system is based on this. Throughout most of history, the way justice worked is someone makes an accusation. If the majority agrees, that they're killed or banished or whatever. The idea of you have a court and you have a trial and you have evidence and you have the right to defend yourself, and what matters is if it's true or not and if you're guilty or not. Those are all rigid principles that didn't exist when there was no rigidity. And if rigidity dies out, they won't exist again. We'll go back to, stoning people because they're unpopular and, because the crowd gets caught up in it. Evidence be damned, right? So these are all rigid tendencies. The idea of democracy as well, that the people, because democracy requires bureaucrats who follow the rules irrespective of who they want to win, right? So they count the votes, and then whoever they want to win, they will accurately count the votes because it's more important to them to do what they should do than for their guy to win. So an aggressive type, it's not at all. It's more important for their guy to win or their girl to win, right? They don't like following the rules. Who cares, So you need the bureaucrats who are in those what should be neutral positions to be rigid. And as soon as those positions start to be held by really any other type, that's when you start to get corruption and you start to get issues and you start to get problems. So the whole system of law we have, the whole system of management and corporate government, the whole system of democracy, it all depends on rigidity. So I know I'm kind of fighting for this, but I think it's out of fashion to be rigid. That's why I'm trying to talk about the benefits a bit more. But yeah, let's talk about some of the other problems with being rigid, because there are many. Before we finish. So one of the other things that is suggested as being a cause of rigidity is when you have parents or primary caregivers who love you based on performance. So if you are successful, if you get an A, if you win the, whatever, the sporting thing, the spelling thing, then you do get genuine praise, love, affection, attention, whatever, gifts. But then when you don't, maybe they don't even punish you. Maybe they just don't give you the love and support that they would do if you were successful, right? It's not necessarily as harsh as it sounds. And it could be well-meaning, the parents. It could just mean if you do really well, the parent goes, yeah, great, well done. And then if you don't, it's, oh, okay. But the child keenly senses that. And so they have this pattern of, I have to be successful I have to be perfect. Get back to that perfection thing. I have to be perfect. I have to be successful in order to be loved. And so that's where they get really, really focused on that. Integrity is also very important to rigid type. Doing what you say. That's a very good thing, unless it gets extreme. It could be extreme in terms of judging other people. You say beer at 8 and it's 8:02, like that kind of thing,
Right.
Lack of any flexibility. And it can be an issue as well if, there's not understanding that other people are not as focused on integrity, right? They're more focused on, their feelings, or they're more focused on their goals in the case of an aggressive person, or they're not even aware of time in the case of a leaving person, or whatever. There's different things going on. Rigid types, unlike aggressive types as well, don't do very well when there is disharmony. They're perfectly capable of dealing with confrontation, but it's more because they're perfectly happy to fight for order and the rules. But it's more that they can't cope if there's a lack of order and a lack of rules. So they really do not thrive in a situation of anarchy, in a situation of chaos. Let's say, where one government's been overthrown and it's not yet clear who the new government is, they would really have an issue with that. I mean,
struggle.
Everyone would because of the chaos, but they're really going to have an issue with that. Ditto in a company. The boss gets fired or leaves, no new boss employed yet. What's going on, So they are very hierarchical, which can mean, at the worst, that they treat people below them as if they're below them, to be acting superior. And also they can be, craven, I guess would be the word, to people above them, right? I don't know how to say it, butt kissing. Basically, rather than treating everyone based on their own merits, they're very prone to treating people based on hierarchy within an organization. And they're very, prone to seeing people who are unsuccessful as you're unsuccessful because you're a loser, or you're unsuccessful because you deserve to be because you didn't work hard enough. So that's one of the illusions of the rigid type, is that if you just work hard enough, then you will be successful. And so therefore, if you're not successful, it must be because you didn't work hard enough, and it's your own fault. So again, as I said, they're more inclined towards that kind of right-wing political perspective, which is not giving to everyone based on the needs, but giving to everyone based on what they've earned. And again, I think more in the middle is appropriate, but those are the two extremes of it. They, because they're so focused on intellectualization, they're very uncomfortable with emotions in general. That can be another issue. So they don't see I felt X as a valid reason to do something or not do something. It's kind of neither here nor there to them. That's obviously an issue in their interpersonal relationship with others, but it's also probably, I would say, more of an issue within themselves, right? If you're always following the rules or what you think is right, what you should do, that means you're not listening to your body. And that disconnection from your body and your own instinct and your own heart can, again, lead to disease, right? I mean, all these pathologies can lead to disease, but this one, again, very obviously, if you're very focused in doing what you should do, overall, it can be good. But let's say if your should is all about, earning money, getting an attractive partner, and, having a better car and a house than your neighbor, then you're going to pursue that, the classic status symbols, then you're going to pursue that as your should, and things like your body and your health and all the rest of it might go out the window. Conversely, if your health becomes your new should, which sometimes happens, then it could be the other way, right? Then you're going to alienate maybe all your relationships because you're so rigid about your diet and your practices and all the rest of it. Do you see what I mean? So it can go in any direction. That the rigidity, if it's extreme, can be a liability. The tendency to be an enforcer of the rules, like a hall monitor kind of thing, doesn't necessarily make them popular. So I said they tend to be admired, but that's kind of they'll often be admired from afar by someone who doesn't have to regularly deal with them enforcing the rules, but they'll often be disliked by anyone who is on the other end of their criticism, judgments, and rule enforcing.
Yeah, especially if they're not likely to give any leeway on certain things. Yeah, that could be difficult.
Absolutely, yeah. One more thing I'll throw in about the rigid type is that they're very focused on responsibility. So the positive side of that is that they are the best at taking personal responsibility. In fact, they tend to be, if anything, over responsible. So they will believe that, more things are their responsibility than there might actually be. The challenge of that is that they are looking at responsibility, and so looking for who's to blame is also often first and foremost on their mind. Whereas an aggressive type, as much as they may be harsh with people, their primary focus is how do we fix this, and more importantly, even how do we get to the goal? Where the rigid type is still focusing on, yeah, but who's at fault? Who did it wrong? Who screwed it up in the first place? And so that can be a challenge. But overall, from my perspective, personal responsibility is something that is out of favor and out of fashion the last few decades. And so it's, again, another beneficial quality that we could do with more of. But of course, it can be overdone where you start to feel like you're responsible for everything. And anything that goes wrong means that you failed. And anything that someone else does wrong means that they failed and you should tell them about it. Yeah.
No, yeah, I can see how that is. And then thinking that they have the responsibility of, as you said, with the rigid type, where they are pointing things out to others like, well, yeah, you shouldn't be doing that, et cetera, et cetera. So it can, go that way. But okay, yeah, that makes sense.
The one other thing about the rigid that they have in common with endurer, just in case this wasn't clear, is they both have parents who really focus on the rules, right? So the endurer is more they were crushed by the rules and they are rebelling against them silently and going along with them. Explicitly they're going along with them, and behind the scenes they are rebelling against them. The rigid type, on the other hand, identified with their parents. So I'd say that's really the difference. The endurer and the rigid type often have similar parents. You might have siblings where one is enduring, one rigid, because it depends whether they identified with their parents' rules or they felt crushed by their parents' rules.
That's a good distinction. Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for going over those 5 personality patterns and giving us that overview. So I did want to ask, because, where you're saying that this is really coming from the traumas or the childhood experiences or certain developmental stages, but do our genetics play a part of this within this system?
I believe so, yes. And as I said, some people who teach this have come to that conclusion as well. I actually do correlate them with the Big Five. And I won't talk about that in this episode because I think this will end up being the longest one we've ever done. But in a not too distant future episode, we're going to go through that. And I'm going to explain how I see a correlation there. And in fact, that there is just anything from a 20 to even a 50% genetic component to this. I just gave an example of that, right? You have a rule-based parents. One person chooses to submit to and resist the rules, and the other person chooses to embody the rules. So why that choice, right? Maybe you have a highly abusive parent. One person, it crushes them. The other person, it emboldens them to feel like they have to go out and be the crusher of other people in turn. So these kind of distinctions about how you respond to things, I think, do have a genetic component to them as to whether you strongly go into a pattern or if it doesn't affect you too much. I gave one example, which is, I think, for instance, people with aristocratic backgrounds are more likely to go into the aggressive pattern. I think that's one of the reasons why, even though we don't have an aristocracy anymore, you still see that the people in positions of power and control often are descended from like ancient kings and queens in Europe and stuff like that, even in America. I don't think it is necessarily a conspiracy of, that's all being orchestrated behind the scenes. I think that it's very possible that it's just that with a certain type of genetic, you just have that tendency to respond to life in that way. And, in the case of the aristocracy, they were actually selectively bred, right? There was a lot of inbreeding going on to keep the level of, royalty, as they put it. But maybe what they saw as royal qualities was just aggressiveness. That rather than being, crushed by life or collapsing into neediness, that you decide you were going to step up and dominate. That's what you want from a leader. As we said, both the good leaders and the bad leaders are both aggressive types. So maybe they were selectively bred for that. And I think there's potentially even selective breeding for other types and traits. I think that it's unpopular to talk about that these days, eugenics and stuff like that. But eugenics, I guess, is primarily thought of as like removing certain people. But I'm talking more about the like encouraging different traits. Like, for instance, the caste system, in India, where people were born into specific roles. I don't think that's good. And I do think that things are not 100% genetic. So, of course, people will be born into roles that they're fundamentally unsuited for, even if both their parents maybe were suited for it. So it's not a great system. But I'm saying those are all attempts maybe to selectively breed people so that their genetics would help them to fit into their role. As I said, if you want a loyal worker, you're more likely to want an enduring pattern in them. If you want a leader, you're more likely to want the aggressive pattern in them. If you want a managerial, clerical class of person, maybe priesthood, that kind of thing, you're more likely to want the rigid pattern in them. And so that, I would say, yeah, there definitely is a genetic component to it that was probably actually understood throughout most of history. As I said, even, again, going back to ancient Egyptian 5,000 years ago, they were selectively breeding at least, the priest class and the royal class. I know that because they wanted these particular qualities in them. So if all of that is true, which I believe it is, then I would say there's definitely a genetic component. And again, the correlation that I've seen between the big five and these character styles has further firmly confirmed to me that there is that correlation.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm looking forward to that episode that we're going to do. So, okay, we'll hold there so we can get into it and dig in deeper. And when we started talking about this, you talked about it these are patterns for a survival strategy. And so I wanted to ask, and you've gone through the list, you've explained certain things. What do these 5 personality patterns, what do they predict?
So once you see what someone's pattern is, your ability to predict how they respond to all kinds of stimuli, if you regularly pay attention, is going to be very good. If you want to position yourself as a false psychic, you would do quite well to learn this system thoroughly, observe people and look at their body and look at how they move, and then start telling them all kinds of things about themselves. And they will be blown away at how accurate you are. You can kind of have a facsimile of that experience yourself, as I said, by reading Stephen Kessler's book. There'll be at least one of those 5 chapters that you read, and maybe I've been able to create that for you even in this, although his book is long. It's like 300 pages. We haven't been able to do anywhere near as much as he has done. But, if you really immerse yourself in it, you're at least one of the chapters, you're going to go, oh my God, it's like, I'm looking in a mirror. It's like I'm reading about my innermost self. You might know things about yourself you didn't even realize about yourself. It's quite an amazing experience. So what can it predict? A lot. As I've given a few examples. It can predict the kind of roles in life that someone will thrive in, the kind of job that they'll do. It will predict what their political leaning is likely to be. It will predict how they relate interpersonally. It will predict what kind of employee they are. It will predict what kind of boss they are. It will predict what kind of health issues they have to some degree. It's predictive power is really massive.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I remember looking at the book, but I need to give it another go. And really, I'm so glad we're doing this because it's like, oh yeah. And thinking about people, as you say, and going, oh, that's what they do. And then as well, being able to know how they're going to respond in a certain situation. Like that, yeah, that's really cool. Okay.
I just want a bit.
Perfect.
As well as doing the work, which we'll talk about in a future episode, that helps you really embody this. I've also read dozens of books on this topic. So, and I'll give you, half a dozen links to my favorite on this topic, Chrissy. Yeah, the fact that you've read the book, I'm not surprised you haven't internalized it all. It's Not easy to learn because it is quite challenging to look at everything in a very new way. And of course, there's a lot of just information as well. But it is very valuable if you want the kind of cheat codes to understand why people do what they do. And of course, other than understanding yourself and other people, which in itself is immensely valuable, the other great thing about this, because you could argue that any good personality assessment helps you understand yourself and other people. The thing that makes this better than all the others to me is, first of all, it's not based on date of birth or anything like that, or self-reporting. It's based on observation. So you can see it by the way a person's body is, by the way they move their body, and the things they say and the way they behave as well. So that's one thing. The body doesn't lie, right? The other thing about it is that you can actually change it. You can heal yourself. So if you listen to any of these and you're like, oh, wow, that's me, that's cool, great. But also if you listen to any of this and go, oh, God, yeah, that is me, then the good news is you can be less of that. With all of these patterns, here's the really great thing. Each of the patterns is like practicing a particular way of being. And so when you do something habitually and compulsively, the bad news is that you are not responding to life as a truly alive, authentic human being. And you are going to sometimes respond inappropriately because you're responding automatically, right? The good news about doing these things in a very compulsive way is you're really practicing how to do them very well. So, whichever pattern, let's say merging, you've really practiced very well reaching out and connecting with people, right? Now, if you address the underlying feeling of needs, and I'm never going to be able to get my needs met, and I'm never going to be good enough, if you resolve all of that, the habit of reaching out and connecting to people will still be there. So you'll still have the strength of that thing. You'll still be able to nurture people. You'll still be able to connect with people. You'll still be able to love people. You'll still be able to be kind and all of those kind of qualities, which the merging type is good at, but it will no longer be coming from a bottomless black hole of need. Mm-hmm. Ditto with aggressive, you'll still be able to assert yourself. You'll still be able to have initiative. You'll still be able to be strong. You'll still be able to be confident. You'll still be able to win at things, but you'll no longer be doing it from a compulsive place of needing to do that and feeling like you're all alone and you can't trust anyone and you can't be vulnerable and all that kind of thing, right? So the good news is you've practiced the strengths, and now if you heal the wound that caused you to over-practice those strengths in the first place, you won't lose the strengths that you developed.
Beautiful. So then I'm going to ask, because, we'll get to the second part of that, going into the evolution from it in a minute. But I wanted to ask, are we conscious of what we're doing with these survival patterns? I mean, no. Are we? Yeah, okay. Because I was going to say, or is it just deeply embedded in the subconscious?
Usually not. And by definition, right? That's the whole point of saying reactive or compulsive. So what that means is you do it automatically. It's autopilot. You might be conscious of it in the sense that if you're self-reflective, then afterwards you can go, oh yeah, I did that automatically. And you might take responsibility, you might apologize, whatever. But in the heat of the moment, no, you're not conscious. That's the whole point of it, unfortunately. And so that's what we want to do. We want to become conscious so that, let's say someone punches in the face, and we can choose which of those 5 things to do is most appropriate, right? We don't have to do one. We don't have to get aggressive and then realize that he's got 3 friends and they're all bigger than you and they're all armed and you're not, and oh, whoops, right? Or you don't have to hunker down and, just take it, because actually, it would be easy to stop the situation, right? Or whatever. Do you see what I mean?
I do.
Responding appropriately is key. And so all of these things, yeah, they can be conscious, but what we're talking about here is the tendency to do them automatically and unconsciously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then because we were talking about, because my question that you touched on it before was, can we evolve beyond this pattern, which is, you said yes. So then following that, it's how?
Well, number one step is awareness. Awareness of what we're doing and awareness of what others are doing, and that they're all valid or equally valid, and in a way equally invalid depending on how compulsive they are. So it's very easy to think that your way is right and everyone else's is wrong. In fact, beyond that, it's very easy to feel like yours is normal and everyone else's is insane. if it's not one of yours, like it seems so alien. And as I said, one of the best parts of one of the reasons I recommend Stephen Kessler's book, and that's the one that I've specifically highlighted rather than any of Lowen's or whatever, is because of the section where he does the empathy exercise. It's so helpful to read through and really understand that other person's perspective and realize that it is valid within its own context. At least it's as valid as yours, right? You could say none of them are valid in a way, or they're all equally valid. And also, if you are one of those types who tends to run the older patterns, the more developed patterns, like the rigid and aggressive, it's very easy to feel that the younger ones are not valid because they don't seem to very, very productive in the world. Like the endurer is always self-sabotaging, and then the merging type is feeling like they can't do anything for themselves, and the leaving type is not bothered about their success in the world at all. So it's like, usually, unless they're combining something else. So it's very easy to judge that. And on the other hand, if you're the earlier types, it's very easy to look at the more developed types and either go, oh, I'm so inferior, they're so much better than me, or the other, and a lot of people do both, go into oh, they're so privileged, right? They're so lucky, and they don't understand how hard it is for me, and all the rest of it. And as I said, like, they all have their strengths and weaknesses. And so it's just really good, rather than getting into judgments, to understand. So that's the first step. Now, that's good. And when you understand that, and when you do other stuff I've talked about before, so even just doing meditation every day, if you combine that with this, you can start becoming more aware in general. When stress comes up, you can be aware, and you can catch yourself before you go into a pattern. Because once you're in the middle of a pattern, it's pretty hard. Once you're already resisting, you're already hiding, you're already fighting, it's kind of very difficult to just stop. But if you can be in the habit of being very present and aware and self-aware, then when that program starts, and you can go, and just catch it and stop it before it goes in. Having said all that, that's the kind of standard advice that you probably heard before. The thing that this system teaches, which is pretty unique, is that it's really, really hard to unwind this stuff without getting into the body. That these patterns are fundamentally linked to and held in place by chronic patterns of compensatory patterns, they're sometimes called, of tension in the body. And so long as those are there, it's a real effort to change your behavior. And often, as soon as your effort goes, so let's say, all right, you're doing meditation and going to seminars and all that, great, you're being less unconscious. But then something happens, and then suddenly you don't sleep very well, and this and that, and then you don't do your meditation practice anymore, you're too busy, and then you're right back to where you were, right? Because the patterns are lodged in the body, and you can override them with enough awareness, which is more the meditative kind of path. But it's often not enduring. Often you will go back to where you were before, unless the pattern in the body is genuinely unwound, which I believe is possible with spiritual practice, but it's pretty damn rare. And so the more easy and direct, I say easy, the more direct approach is to get into the body and to undo. Undoing tension is probably even not quite accurate. It's to undo the lack of connection and awareness in the body. That's really the key. And that's what Lowen talks about over and over and over again, is that what all of these patterns have in common is they are all disconnected from their body. Now, again, some more than most. And in a way, aggressive is the most fortunate position because they're pretty connected with their body and they're quite connected with their gut instinct, even if their heart is sometimes, they're not fully connected with the heart. But some people are, sometimes very disconnected from the body, like the whole body, like the leaving type. But that connection with the body, so between the brain and the body, is really key. And I gave an example of this before, but it's like, it's being aware that you're doing something, right? It's like you're grinding your teeth, or you're clenching your jaw. Are you aware of that? You're tightening your fist. Are you aware of that? You're tucking in your tail, which is a submission position. Are you aware of that? You're reaching forwards with your head. Are you aware of that, right? And so there's awareness, and then there is doing particular techniques to undo that pattern. And we'll talk about that in another episode because it's the whole thing.
Wonderful. Okay, so then, with that, then with the thing that we're going to talk about the next episode, what are the goals of doing that?
It's a good question. So as I said, like the whole basis of a society is based on us running these patterns. I gave examples like within an organization about how each of the roles, often fulfill a specific function. And I'd say, within any unit, family unit, country, whatever, that is the case to some degree. So the goal of it is ultimately freedom from being an automaton, to be truly conscious and aware. So I guess enlightenment or something like that we could see as the goal. The kind of same goal that Eckhart Tolle talks about being fully present. The goal originally with Reich, so he talked about another type, he called it the genital type. So he talked about all of these types, what they have in common is that they're stuck in quite a childish view of the world, right? Even the later ones, we're talking about aggressive or rigid, they're still like the perspectives of a 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old. These are not fully adult perspectives, even though they seem a lot more developed compared to, the 6-month-old perspective, say. And so ultimately, this system itself doesn't really talk about things like enlightenment and spiritual stuff. They actually talk about grounding, being in the body, and fully maturing. So the goal of the system, I would say, really is to be an adult rather than a child. And so one way of looking at all these types I just talked about is which level of childishness are you stuck in? Because that's what they all are. Including the rigid type, who seems the most adult, because they're the ones going around enforcing the rules and acting the most like a little adult. But they're still, their black and white thinking, their lack of heart connection, all the stuff I talked about, still makes their perspective fundamentally childish, right? So that's why it was called the genital type, because he saw, like the genitals don't really come in line until you're a teenager. So like that you've actually reached that level of evolution, and the vast majority of us haven't from this perspective. So Lowen expanded on that more, and what he said is this: in our society, a lot of us, like the aggressive philosophy is really starting to win out along with the merging. So, they talk about the attention economy, and there's the kind of might makes right kind of philosophy, and like power being the fundamental thing that, has really been the whole last century has become more and more at the forefront. And he said that the real key to being a happy human is pleasure. Now, I've got to explain this. This is not the pleasure of the oral type. This is not a narcissistic, self-satisfied, indulgent pleasure. This is the pleasure of having energy freely flowing through your body and giving you the energy and the motivation to enjoy life and engage with life fully in a relaxed, calm, centered, present way. But here's the crucial thing, and actually, a lot of enlightened people and spiritual teachers teach this. When you're enlightened, you have feelings of ecstasy coursing through your body on an ongoing basis. Pleasure is really, like Sadhguru talks about this, pleasure or something beyond pleasure in your body is actually the natural default state. And so one of the reasons why we hold these patterns of tension is because we are suppressing, yes, painful feelings. We don't want to feel anger. We don't want to feel sadness. We don't want to feel vulnerability, whatever. But actually, children in general can't handle any intense feelings. They don't have the capacity to process it. It's one of the reasons why sexuality is so damaging for children, even though it's a pleasurable feeling, is because they don't have the capacity to deal with that feeling yet. That's why it's so crucial that it's not activated in them until they become adult. And so the feeling of pleasure of just having energy flow through your body is very intense. And so one of the side effects of doing the practice that we talked about is, yes, painful emotions can come up. You can start feeling anger you haven't wanted to admit to. You can start feeling fear that you've wanted to avoid, all that kind of stuff. But another thing that comes up is pleasure. You start feeling a lot of pleasure in your body. And especially if you are like some of the types, like the endurer types, this really freaks them out because their fundamental philosophy of life is suffering. You start feeling good all the time for no reason. That's very, very challenging.
Right.
But in a way with the rigid types as well. It's with the rigid types, it's like this is not proper, right? The kind of uptight prude kind of thing. Like we're not supposed to be feeling this good. We can't all be feeling this good. Life isn't a game, right? We're going to take it seriously. So every type has resistance to this in their own way. Those are just two that I've picked on there. So ultimately, the goal is, to be more conscious, to be more aware. But all that stuff is sounds good, maybe highly desirable sometimes, but it's also kind of boring. Truth is the real goal is to feel this vital energy flowing through us at all time, filling us with, joy and enthusiasm and love and, a connection, not just to someone else fulfilling our needs or not just to someone else in an intimate way, but actually with everything, to feel connected to the whole universe. And I think Lowen probably achieved that. Reading his writings, I don't think that someone is, that focused on that without experiencing it, at least a lot of the time. And I would recommend his works as well, even though I haven't focused that much. His books are really good at understanding that connection between the body and behavior. It's really good for that. And he really emphasized this point I've just said over and over and over again, that whatever your goals are, they're wrong. If you're rigid, you want to be successful. If you're aggressive, you want to be in power. If you're merging, you want to have your needs met. If you're enduring, you want to be, just kind of left alone, usually. You want autonomy. You want to be able to do what you want to do. If you're leaving, you want to create stuff and just, be able to think about whatever you want to think about. These are all poor goals, actually, from a this perspective. The real goal is to feel fully alive. That's ultimately what we want to do. And yes, we want to feel intense pleasure and intense joy and intense love and stuff like that, but not overwhelming, right? We also want to be centered and we want to be grounded and we want to be present and we want to be sober, if that's a word for it. So not, taken away, but able to still function in a very, very high level in the world, but to feel really, really good while we're doing it.
Beautiful. Well said. Yeah, I like that. I wanted to ask because, thank you. You're the one that has educated me and brought this, the 5 personality patterns and all of this to my attention and my awareness. And I wanted to ask you because it's like, you don't see it out there. Why isn't this system more well known?
It's a good question. I think one of the reasons is because, the charismatic guy who came up with most of it, as I said, kind of went off on a different tangent. He may have been right about his devices that cured people. We'll never know because, he was crushed. I think the main thing that held it back was the fact that the names of it were so insulting. So do I want to go around telling you, I'm an oral psychopath or I'm a rigid masochist or whatever? It's such... And if I say it about you, look, I've done it because I, have that tendency to say whatever I think. And I've told people what types they are. Generally, they don't like it, So they're all insulting terms. I think actually the last 5 to 10 years, things have flipped now and people like to say they're depressed and there's a whole kind of undercurrent, right, on social media of people who like to identify with having serious mental illnesses of all kind. I heard of borderline, for instance. There's a whole fad of people wanting to say they're borderline. There's borderline influencers. 10, 15 years ago, saying that someone is borderline is not that much different from saying they're an asshole. And, so it's kind of flipped from an insult to a trendy thing to say you have a severe. So maybe if someone had invented it 5 years ago, it would be really trendy now. And I think, it's possible it still may get popularity. The other thing I think is people like comforting lies more than they like harsh truths. We talked about this with diet. We recently filmed our Feel Younger diet episode. I stated in that, and I know it's negative, but I know it's never going to be as successful as the Atkins diet or the keto diet or the South Beast diet or whatever, because it's not simple. It's complicated. You have to think, and people want something simple and easy. So this is not simple and easy. It's also very challenging. It's pointing out things, no matter what name you give it, whether I tell you that you're a psychopath or I tell you you're aggressive or whether I tell you you're leaving or schizoid. Basically, I'm still telling you a lot of stuff about yourself you probably don't want to know about yourself. So it takes a certain person who really wants to seek the truth. And generally, that is either rigids or aggressive types. However, the rigid and aggressive types, even though they're most likely to embrace truth, they're the least likely to seek self-reflection because they're the most successful and functional in society. And so they don't think there's anything wrong with them. They're like, well, help this person. They're depressed. This person's full of anxiety. I'm great. So that's a challenge. And then lastly, the system that it's based on of actually becoming free that I was just talking about is challenging to do. It is not easy. It involves pushing yourself, which involves, self-discipline, but, a particular type of self-discipline, which even rigid types don't like. It's kind of self-discipline to start feeling things, which they don't want to do. Tendency to have this chronic tension. It's not good for no type. What I mean is it's not appealing to any type, right? Most types are not interested in pushing themselves really hard. Actually, honestly, it's probably most appealing to the endurance type because they like to suffer. So they can push themselves really hard physically, which is often required, and they're willing to go through the painful feelings. But they often freak out when they start to feel the pleasure and the joy and the benefits, and then stop doing it. So it's kind of, there's something about it that is objectionable to everyone. So I think it is probably never going to become super popular because the best stuff usually isn't. This is the reality. I know this sounds elitist, but most people are not sufficiently motivated to really be free, to be fully alive. Generally, I think the motivation comes from either sometimes it comes from wanting to reach a high standard. So maybe a rigid type will find this, and I've met them, and they'll be like, they're up for the challenge. They decide it's a new level of perfection they want to reach. But usually more likely it's that the suffering that you've experienced or are experiencing is so intense, whether it's physical or emotional or whatever, that you're like, I'll do whatever it takes. And then you find this and you are able to overcome the resistance and fear that comes from when you hear something like this that could really work, and do it and keep doing it. And it's tricky. And I'll give yet one more reason. I think because not many people have found it, I don't think that there has been a really charismatic spokesperson for it before. And I don't know if I'm charismatic enough, but I hope that by putting this out there and increasing awareness, I can help that person to discover about it. Probably someone who's really strongly aggressive pattern, actually, who's very charismatic and very, willing to push something out there and say, this is the best thing ever, and really sell it. Mm-hmm. I think it really needs someone like that, who is both very, probably rigid, aggressive, who is, both perceived as a role model and also very willing to go out there and sell it. I would say, like a Tony Robbins of bioenergetic character style, someone like that, someone who's willing to sell it and make it look good. I think if that person comes along and finds it and does that, then it will take off big style, because it really does help. It really does work. And it's really accurate and helpful in terms of understanding people as well, as we talked about today.
Well, beautiful, Elwin. This has been highly educational, and thank you. Well, one, for bringing it to me, because I know it's really helped me, and also for bringing it to everybody else. Are there any final thoughts that you'd like to share before we close?
Yeah, I think if you're still watching this, then you are probably that elite 1% or whatever. And I'd highly encourage you to check out the other people who I've recommended and really dive into this. This is very likely to be for you if you're still watching or listening.
Wonderful. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Please make sure that you hit that like and subscribe button and that bell icon so you don't miss an episode. And remember, we are going to carry on this conversation with the next steps and that technique that Elwin talked about today for being able to evolve beyond the pattern. So please make sure that you don't miss that episode, and we'll see you next time.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed that video. You may have noticed I recommended a few different videos in that episode, and one of the ones I recommend is just here, if you want to click there, or another one I recommend is just below, if you want to click on that one and watch that next.